Ever wonder how your ancestors, those hardy, perpetually confused individuals from the Middle Ages, managed to not freeze to death in what amounted to a giant snowball Earth, armed with nothing but questionable dental hygiene and a healthy, all-encompassing fear of just about everything? Yeah, neither did they, probably. They were too busy trying to figure out if that strange lump in their gruel was a potato or a particularly well-preserved rat. Imagine waking up every single morning, your breath misting like a cheap fog machine in the frigid air, your bladder screaming for relief, knowing that the outside world was just a vast, cold, damp expanse of pure, unadulterated misery. Now, imagine that misery suddenly decide to get a whole lot colder, wetter, and altogether more existential. These weren't the folks with thermal underwear, mind you. They barely had underwear. We're talking about a level of unpreparedness so profound, it makes your current winter wardrobe look like it was designed by NASA. Their primary defense against hypothermia was sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness and the occasional huddle with a goat. You might chuckle, but their existence was a delicate dance on the precipice of oblivion, a precarious tightrope walk between a lukewarm bowl of pottage and the endless void of hypothermia. Every day was a question, an unspoken plea to the heavens. Dear God, please don't let my feet fall off today. And then, just for good measure, God seemingly decided to turn down the global thermostat a few notches, just to see what would happen. Humanity, being humanity, mostly just shivered and complained, but kept on existing. Because what else were they going to do? Complain to HR? Now, before you start envisioning woolly mammoths stampeding through a medieval market town, trampling bewildered peasants and their artisanal cheeses, let's clarify. We're not talking about that kind of ice age. This wasn't the Pleistocene, the epic of grand continental glaciers carving out fjords and making the Earth look like a discarded Slurpee. No. This was something far more insidious, a slow, creeping, soul-crushing cold that felt less like a dramatic, cinematic disaster and more like a perpetually terrible Tuesday, stretching on for centuries. Welcome, my friends, to the Little Ice Age, a historical period roughly from the 14th to the 19th century when Europe and parts of North America experienced significantly colder winters and cooler, wetter summers. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event, more like Mother Nature slowly, deliberately turning down the global thermostat and then losing the knob. Imagine someone constantly leaving the fridge door ajar, except the fridge is your entire known world. Your daily life, already a masterclass in stoic endurance, was about to become even more quaint. We're talking late frosts that decimated budding crops, early snowfalls that buried harvests, rivers freezing solid for months on end, and a pervasive dampness that seemed to seep directly into your very bones, forever. This wasn't a quick, merciful freeze. It was the slow, agonizing chill of 1,000 consecutive bad weather forecasts, each one a tiny, soul-destroying blow to an already fragile existence. It made winter blues an actual, literal, life-threatening condition. So settle in, perhaps with a warm beverage, something our medieval protagonists would consider an unimaginable luxury, possibly even witchcraft. For the next, 200 minutes, we're going on a deep dive. Not into the glorious battles or the intricate politics of kings and queens, because, frankly, who cares about royalty when you're busy trying to stop your toes from turning black? No, we're diving headfirst into the very real, very smelly, and often tragically hilarious historical suffering of the common folk. The unsung heroes who woke up every day, shivered, toiled, and somehow, against all odds, managed to reproduce enough to ensure your own surprisingly comfortable existence. We'll explore their ingenious and often disgusting survival tactics, their peculiar superstitions, their culinary nightmares, and their unwavering ability to find misery in almost any situation. And yes, we'll liberally sprinkle this tale of woe with cynical observations, dry wit, and enough dark humor to make you question your own sanity for finding it amusing. Because sometimes, when the historical outlook is this bleak, all you can do is laugh. Or cry. Mostly laugh, though. So, without further ado, let's peel back the layers of grime and suffering and discover exactly, precisely, unequivocally how medieval peasants survived the brutal Ice Age. Brace yourselves. It's going to be a long, cold, and utterly fascinating journey. All right, let's get one thing straight right off the bat. Forget everything you've seen in those overly cheerful Renaissance fair brochures or quaint medieval-themed movies. You know the ones where everyone is inexplicably clean, well-fed, and dancing around a maypole as if they don't have a crushing burden of feudal obligations and the constant threat of dysentery looming over their heads. Our heroes, the medieval peasants, were almost certainly too hungry, too exhausted, and far too covered in fleas and other various bodily fluids for such frivolous activities. Their lives were not a pastoral dream. There was no artisanal sourdough, no organic kale from their sustainable garden plots, and certainly no charming cottagecore aesthetic. The reality was a relentless cycle of back-breaking labor, punctuated by periods of acute starvation and the occasional plague. Imagine a life where your primary hobbies were not dying today and praying for more turnips. That was their baseline. Their average lifespan, assuming they made it past the perilous gauntlet of childhood diseases, was about 30 to 35 years. That's right. By the time you're contemplating a midlife crisis, they were already contemplating their grandchildren's first harvest, if they were lucky enough to even have grandchildren. They lived in homes that would make your garden shed look like a 5-star resort, lacked anything resembling modern medicine, and generally understood that their existence was a temporary, painful prelude to whatever came next. And spoiler alert, what came next was often more pain. Even before the world decided to go full-on freezer burn, the medieval peasants' daily grind was what we might charitably call relentless. Imagine, if you will, the gentle embrace of dawn. Not the aesthetic, Instagram-worthy kind, but the kind where the sun is barely a hint of gray on the horizon, and the air is still biting. You'd be waking not to an alarm clock, but to the urgent needs of your bladder, the incessant crowing of a particularly obnoxious rooster, or the frantic gnawing of rats in the thatch above your head. Your first act? Probably not a leisurely coffee, but rather stumbling outside, past the sleeping pig you share your dwelling with, to relieve yourself in a designated ditch. Then it's straight to work. The land called, always. From dawn till dusk, you were tethered to the soil. Plowing, sowing, harrowing, weeding, harvesting. The words sound simple, but each was a Herculean task, performed with the most rudimentary tools. Your primary concerns weren't your 401k or your next vacation. They were the next meal, the next harvest, not dying of dysentery this week, and ensuring you didn't accidentally offend the local lord, or worse, God, in that specific, tactical order. Your life revolved around the sun and the soil, a constant, visceral connection to the earth, a relationship that was about to get extremely complicated by a boo-boo. Now, it would be easy to dismiss these folks as simple, superstitious, and generally ill-equipped for anything, but that would be a grave injustice, or, at least, a mildly inaccurate one. You see, our medieval peasant was already, in their own unique, grim way, a master of resilience. They were born into a world of hardship, weaned on scarcity, and generally understood that every day was a minor miracle of not succumbing to some new, horrifying malady or misfortune. They were, in essence, experts in suffering. Their bodies were hardened by constant labor, their minds by the pervasive threat of the unknown, and their spirits by a quiet, stoic determination to just keep going. They knew how to make do with precious little. They understood the rhythm of the seasons, the nuances of the soil, and the subtle signs of nature. They were the original preppers, just without the tactical gear and the underground bunkers. They could identify edible weeds, mend broken tools with ingenuity, and squeeze every last drop of sustenance from a seemingly barren landscape. The Little Ice Age didn't introduce them to suffering, it just gave them a master's degree in it. It was like taking an already incredibly difficult exam and then adding several bonus rounds of increasingly impossible questions, all while the room slowly fills with ice water. And somehow, they still manage to pass. Mostly. So, what in the name of all that is cold and miserable was this Little Ice Age anyway? Was it a vengeful deity, finally fed up with humanity's shenanigans? Was it a cosmic prank by some bored celestial entity? Or was it, as actual science suggests, a rather unfortunate confluence of terrestrial and extraterrestrial events that decided to make life significantly more challenging for our ancestors? Mostly the latter, though I'm sure the vengeful deity theory had better marketing at the time. We're talking about a simplified, humorous explanation here, not a dissertation on paleoclimatology. Imagine Earth just had a minor, yet persistent, headache. Some theories point to increased volcanic activity, which would spew ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing global temperatures to dip. Think of it as a permanent, incredibly depressing gray filter over the sun. Others suggest a decrease in solar activity, fewer sunspots, less solar radiation reaching Earth. Effectively, the sun just decided to take a few very long naps. And then there are oceanic circulation changes, like the slowing of the Gulf Stream, which typically brings warmer waters to northern Europe. All these factors, like a group of terribly mismanaged orchestral musicians, conspired to play a particularly dreary, chilling symphony. Not a cataclysmic Hollywood blockbuster movie event with a dramatic single-point origin, but a slow, insidious creep of cold that felt less like a dramatic disaster and more like a perpetually terrible Tuesday for about 500 years. Brutal. Now, you might think, what's a few degrees, really? Just put on a thicker jumper. And for you, in your heated home with central heating and a wardrobe full of ethically sourced merino wool, that might be true. But for a society absolutely, entirely, fundamentally reliant on predictable growing seasons, even a minor temperature drop was a seismic event. Agrarian societies, like medieval Europe, lived and died by the harvest. Their entire social, economic, and political structure was built upon the assumption that spring would arrive, the seeds would sprout, the summer sun would ripen the crops, and autumn would bring a bounteous harvest. It was a delicate, intricate dance with nature. The Little Ice Age, with its colder springs, wetter summers, and earlier frosts, essentially stomped all over that dance floor. Turns out, farming doesn't work so well when your fields are frozen solid for half the year, or when a relentless, unceasing drizzle turns your wheat into soggy mush. Livestock, too, suffered from lack of fodder and increased disease in damp conditions. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a direct assault on the very foundation of their existence. It was the equivalent of your entire internet infrastructure suddenly deciding to work only 3 days a week, and then only for an hour at a time. Catastrophic, in other words. Let's distinguish between cold, the kind that makes you pull your blanket tighter and maybe complain on Twitter, and existentially threatening cold. Medieval homes were, shall we say, rustic. Wattle and daub walls, thatch roofs, dirt floors, and often no proper chimneys. They were essentially very leaky, slightly insulated tents. Modern homes are built to keep heat in, with multiple layers of insulation, sealed windows, and heating systems. Medieval homes were designed to keep most of the rain out and some of the wind at bay, assuming a temperate climate. They were utterly, comically ill-equipped for sustained, generational cold. A slight dip in average temperature, say 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, when compounded over centuries, meant profoundly longer winters, more frequent blizzards, and a permanent, pervasive dampness that no amount of prayer or huddled body heat could truly dispel. This wasn't a slight inconvenience. It was a full-blown crisis, transforming familiar landscapes into hostile environments, turning fertile fields into frozen mud pits, and making every breath a slightly painful reminder of your impending doom. It meant that for the average peasant, the world wasn't just cold, it was actively trying to kill them, slowly, meticulously, and with a rather nasty cough. Before the Great Chill, medieval Europe operated on an agricultural system that was, in its own way, a marvel of communal inefficiency and feudal obligation, the open field system, nestled within the broader structure of manorialism. Imagine, if you will, an entire village acting as one giant, perpetually tired farming collective. There were no neat, individual, fenced-off fields. Instead, the arable land surrounding the village was divided into vast open fields, typically 3, which were then further subdivided into long, narrow strips. Each peasant family was allocated a scattering of these strips across different fields, ensuring everyone had a share of both good and bad soil. This system was designed for communal effort. Plowing required oxen teams that only the wealthier peasants, or the lord, possessed, necessitating cooperation. It also meant a shared workload, for better or worse. And above all this sat the lord of the manor, who owned the land, the mill, and often the very air you breathed. In exchange for protection, and sometimes just the privilege of existing on his land, you, the peasant, paid rent in labor, goods, and often a portion of your harvest, the lord's share. It was a system so perfectly designed for endless labor and minimal personal gain, a beautifully intricate mechanism of exploitation, that it's almost admirable in its chilling efficacy. You worked, he profited, and the cycle continued, unbroken by frivolous notions like personal property or fair wages. The rhythm of peasant life was dictated by the seasons, a relentless, cyclical litany of toil that made your most demanding work week look like a spa retreat. As the first hints of spring thawed the earth, it was time for plowing. Imagine walking behind a heavy wooden plow, pulled by oxen, the sticky, dense soil resisting every turn, your muscles screaming in protest. Then came sowing, casting precious seeds by hand, hoping against hope that enough would germinate to feed your family through the next winter. This was followed by harrowing, smoothing the soil, and then the long, tedious months of weeding, done on your hands and knees, battling against nature's persistent attempts to reclaim the cultivated land. Summer brought its own brutal demands, haymaking for animal fodder, and the constant vigilance against pests and disease. And then, the grand finale, harvest. Scythes swinging in unison, cutting wheat and barley, binding sheaves, stacking them, threshing them to separate grain from chaff. Every single grain was a triumph. After harvest, the communal fields were open to livestock to graze, and then the whole brutal cycle would begin anew. There was no margin for error. One bad harvest, one unexpected pestilence, one relentless rain, and your family, your entire village, could be plunged into ruin and starvation. It was a tightrope walk over an abyss, every single year. Let's be honest. If the medieval economy were a corporation, the peasants were the tireless, thankless IT department. They were the ones who kept the servers running, metaphorically speaking, enduring the constant reboots, the system crashes, and the perpetual, vague demands for management, the lords, clergy, and king who had no earthly idea how anything actually worked. Without them, the entire magnificent, complicated edifice of feudalism would have collapsed faster than a poorly constructed wattle and daub wall in a hurricane. Without their calloused hands, their aching backs, and their unwavering, if often grudging, labor, there would be no food. No food meant no taxes, no armies, no fancy tapestries, no elaborate cathedrals, and certainly no opulent feasts for the nobility. The lords would have had to, gasp, work for themselves? Unthinkable! These were the people who powered the world, fueled the wars, built the castles, and generally ensured that everyone else could get on with their more important business of praying, fighting, or looking regal. Their contribution was monumental, their reward minuscule, and their appreciation often non-existent. They were the silent, suffering backbone, the gears that grinded the entire machine forward, often lubricated only by sweat, tears, and the occasional spilled ale. So next time you see a painting of a medieval lord looking very important, just remember the unseen peasant, knee-deep in mud, who made his very existence possible. So, what did a good year look like for our medieval peasant before the world decided to embrace a new, chilling aesthetic? It wasn't about annual bonuses, promotions, or a successful Kickstarter campaign for a new type of plow. A good year was a year where you didn't starve to death. A good year meant your children, miraculously, didn't all succumb to the latest wave of childhood fevers or the ubiquitous dysentery. A good year meant the Lord, in his infinite, self-serving wisdom, only took most of your harvest, not all of it, leaving you just enough to scrape by until the next growing season. It meant the summer was long enough to ripen the grain, the rains came but weren't a constant deluge, and the winter, while undoubtedly harsh, didn't claim too many of your precious livestock or freeze your fields solid for an unseasonable amount of time. Simple pleasures were profound. A full belly, even if it was just gruel, a warmish fire fueled by scavenged wood, the temporary absence of crippling pain, and the blissful thought that, for this week at least, you probably weren't going to die of some unforeseen, gruesome ailment. Their metric for success wasn't about thriving, it was about the precarious art of not failing spectacularly. It was about hitting rock bottom, looking up, and seeing that at least the rocks weren't actively falling on your head, yet. Believe it or not, before the Little Ice Age decided to gate-crash the party, medieval Europe actually enjoyed what historians lovingly refer to as the medieval warm period. Imagine, for a moment, a time when grapes could be cultivated as far north as England, when harvests were generally reliable, and when the prospect of a genuinely warm summer wasn't a pipe dream. It was, relatively speaking, a golden age of agricultural prosperity. Envision a typical summer harvest scene. The sun, a generous golden orb in the sky, beating down on fields of ripe, swaying grain. The air, thick with the scent of cut wheat, sweat, and perhaps a distant aroma of animal manure. Peasants, still toiling, of course, because some things never change, but with a palpable sense of purpose and the quiet hum of activity. Laughter, perhaps, echoing across the fields, not the maniacal laughter of impending doom, but the genuine, if weary, mirth of people seeing the fruits of their labor. The granaries would be reasonably full, the livestock healthy, and the children, though still grubby and prone to various ills, wouldn't be perpetually shivering. They were, in their unwitting fortune, experiencing the pinnacle of medieval agricultural possibility, a fleeting moment of climatic grace. They thought they had problems then. Oh, you sweet summer children, you had no idea. And that, perhaps, is the darkest humor of all. Their profound, utterly innocent naivete. They lived their lives, generation after generation, accepting the occasional bad harvest, the brutal winter, the endemic diseases, as simply the way things are. They had no concept of global climate patterns, no historical data stretching back centuries, no understanding that the very earth beneath their feet was about to betray them in the most fundamental way. They attributed bad weather to God's wrath, a local witch's curse, or simply bad luck. The thought that the entire planet was slowly but surely turning against them would have been utterly beyond comprehension. They worried about the wolf in the woods, the bandit on the road, the Lord's tax collector, and the persistent itch of fleas. They did not worry about the sun getting colder or the rivers freezing for too long. They simply adapted, as humans do, to their immediate circumstances. They were about to learn, in the most brutal and prolonged way imaginable, that sometimes the biggest monster isn't a dragon or a demon, but a subtle, relentless shift in global weather patterns. And for that, there was no prayer, no witch burning, and no feudal lord with a shiny sword who could save them. Only endless, persistent cold. Before the Little Ice Age decided to turn every meal into a high-stakes scavenger hunt, the medieval diet was, shall we say, a culinary adventure in blandness. Forget your artisanal charcuterie boards or your avocado toast. If you were a peasant, Your plate was a monotonous landscape of beige and brown. Gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from oats, barley, or peas, was a breakfast, lunch, and dinner staple. Coarse, often stale, bread, typically a dense, dark loaf made from rye or barley, served as both sustenance and makeshift plate. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots, if you could grow them, made up the bulk of your caloric intake, often boiled into a meager pottage with whatever scraps of greens or pulses could be found. Meat was a rare, almost mythical luxury, usually reserved for feast days, after a successful hunt, by the Lord, not you, or if an animal had conveniently died of natural causes, and you could get to it before the rats did. If you're looking for Michelin stars or even a single Yelp review above 2 stars, you're several centuries too early and several social classes too low. Variety was a foreign concept. Spice was an aristocratic privilege, and a genuinely delicious meal was probably something you dreamed about while you gnawed on a piece of dried, questionable fish. Every mouthful was less about pleasure and more about simply staving off the gnawing pangs of hunger for a few more hours. Even in the good old days of the medieval warm period, life for a peasant was a constant tightrope walk over the chasm of localized famine. The concept of a modern, interconnected global food supply chain was, quite literally, unthinkable. If your village's harvest failed, for whatever reason, too much rain, too little rain, a blight, an invasion of particularly peckish locusts, you were, to put it mildly, in serious trouble. There was no vast network of refrigerated trucks bringing fresh produce from warmer climes. Transporting bulk grain or other foodstuffs over long distances was incredibly difficult, expensive, and often dangerous due to poor roads and bandits. So if your neighbors were also starving, which they often were in these localized crises, you had precisely nowhere to turn. A single failed harvest could plunge an entire village, a region, or even a small kingdom into devastating hunger. People would eat their seed grain, slaughter their precious draft animals, and eventually resort to whatever roots, bark, or questionable creatures they could find. The resilience of these communities was constantly tested, but their vulnerability was always just beneath the surface, a fragile ecosystem waiting for the slightest tremor to send it crashing down. The Little Ice Age was about to deliver a whole series of tremors, leading to an unprecedented food crisis. Given the constant threat of famine, you'd think medieval storage methods would be paragons of efficiency. You'd be mostly wrong. Their methods were primitive, but vital, and a constant battle against the elements and persistent pests. Grain, the lifeblood of their existence, was typically stored in communal granaries, wooden chests, or pits lined with straw or clay. But dampness was the eternal enemy, encouraging rot and mildew. Rats and weevils were a persistent, insatiable menace, nibbling away at precious stores, turning what little sustenance there was into a contaminated, bug-ridden mess. Meats were salted, smoked, or dried, a process that required considerable effort and skill, and still didn't guarantee long-term preservation against spoilage or the attentions of various hungry creatures. Vegetables and fruits were stored in cool, dark cellars, if one was available, or simply dried. Imagine having zero refrigeration, no airtight containers, and rats as your primary food critics. Every preserved item was a small act of hope, a desperate gamble against the inevitable decay and consumption by unwelcome guests. These meager stores were all that stood between a family and starvation, a thin, fragile barrier against the harsh realities of winter. When the Little Ice Age hit, these already challenged storage methods were put under unimaginable strain, turning hope in a barrel into despair in a damp, gnawed-upon sack. Let's talk about the cutting-edge technology of medieval agriculture, or rather, the distinctly blunt-edge technology. Our peasants were working with what was essentially an Iron Age, or slightly later if you're feeling generous, toolkit, which was about as prepared for a sustained climatic downturn as a pair of flip-flops is for an Everest expedition. The ard, or scratch plow, was essentially a sharpened piece of wood, sometimes tipped with iron, that merely scratched the surface of the soil rather than turning it over. Effective for light, sandy soils, less so for heavy, waterlogged clay, and utterly useless for frozen earth. Then came the heavy plow, a true innovation, with a coulter, a knife to cut the turf, a share to cut horizontally, and a mold board to turn the furrow. A significant step up, but still a cumbersome beast requiring multiple oxen and immense human effort to steer. For harvesting, there was the scythe, a magnificent instrument for cutting hay, but a back-breaking tool for grain when combined with the stoop of the reaper. Hoes, rakes, and sickles completed the ensemble of misery. No tractors, no combine harvesters, no automated irrigation. Just raw, unadulterated, bone-grinding, back-breaking effort powered by thin gruel and a desperate, often futile, optimism. The sheer physical labor required for any agricultural task was monumental, a testament to the fact that humans used to be significantly tougher, or at least had far fewer options. When you don't have access to NASA satellites, complex meteorological models, or even a basic understanding of soil chemistry, what do you rely on? Instinct, tradition, and a lot of very earnest prayer. Medieval peasants were masters of observation, honed by generations of intimate connection to the land. They planted by the moon phases, believing the celestial cycles influenced growth. They looked to animal behavior. If the geese flew south early, a harsh winter was coming. If the cows lay down in the field, rain was imminent. They watched the trees, the clouds, the feel of the air, all seeking subtle clues from nature. They relied on ancestral wisdom, passed down through oral tradition, lore that had been accumulated over centuries of farming in a relatively stable climate. This traditional knowledge was, for the most part, pragmatic and effective. It worked for the conditions they had always known. But what happens when those conditions fundamentally change? What happens when all your traditional signs point to one thing, but the reality is something else entirely? What happens when nature itself seems to have lost its rhythm? All that accumulated wisdom was about to be proven wrong, not because it was inherently faulty, but because the game had fundamentally changed, and no one had told the players. Imagine trying to clear a heavily snow-laden driveway with a teaspoon. That's roughly the equivalent of how utterly unprepared their basic agricultural tools were for the sustained onslaught of the Little Ice Age. Their wooden plows, while adequate for regular soil, were about as effective for frozen tundra or waterlogged heavy clay as a politician's promise. The scythes and sickles, designed for cutting pliable stalks, were useless when crops failed to ripen or were flattened by relentless rain and early snow. Everything they had, every simple implement, every practiced technique, was finely tuned for a specific climatic paradigm. When that paradigm shifted, the tools simply couldn't keep up. There was no medieval equivalent of a snowplow or a frost-resistant seed drill. Their technology had stagnated, largely because the conditions they faced didn't demand radical innovation, just consistent, tireless effort. Now, the demand for innovation was suddenly immense, but the resources, knowledge, and sheer capacity to innovate were utterly lacking. Their world was changing faster than their ability to adapt, leaving them exposed and vulnerable, reliant on the same old, familiar tools that were suddenly failing them with grim regularity. A wooden plow is great for regular soil, less so for a permanently frozen, boggy nightmare. Before the brutal cold decided to equalize everyone in their misery, there was, of course, a distinctly unequal social order, the feudal system. At the very top, glittering with crowns and questionable hygiene, was the king, theoretically ruling by divine right, though often just by brute force and a decent army. Below him, the lords, a collection of dukes, counts, barons, and knights who held vast tracts of land, fiefs, from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. They, in turn, had their own vassals. Then came the clergy, the monks, priests, and bishops who held enormous spiritual sway and often considerable land and wealth. And then, way, way down at the absolute bottom of this elaborate hierarchical pyramid, scraping by in their wattle and daub hovels, were you, the peasant, the serf, the villain, the unfree laboring class. You owned nothing, not even yourself, effectively tied to the land you worked. Your worth was measured in your ability to produce food and taxes. It was a perfectly efficient system for consolidating power and wealth at the top, ensuring everyone else stayed precisely where they were meant to be. A rigid, unyielding social ladder where climbing was largely impossible, and even slipping a rung meant utter destitution or death. Now, you might think a global climate crisis would be an equalizer, and in the very long run, perhaps it was. But initially, the impact of the Ice Age was a brutal demonstration of the feudal system's inherent unfairness. The disaster, like everything else, trickled down. It hit the peasants first, hardest, and with the least recourse. While your lord might be worrying about his prized tapestry collection being damaged by damp or the cost of importing spices from a frozen port, you were worrying about your toes turning black or whether your youngest child would survive the week on a diet of boiled weeds. The disconnect was profound. The nobility and clergy, with their granaries, their reserves of wealth, their ability to command resources, were insulated, at least initially, from the immediate, visceral impact of crop failures and freezing temperatures. They might notice their incomes dwindling, their feasts becoming less lavish, but they weren't literally starving to death in their drafty castles. The peasants, however, were on the front lines, bearing the full brunt of nature's indifference, with no safety net whatsoever. The cold, like a cruel hand, simply pushed those already precariously balanced on the edge straight into the abyss. The feudal system was theoretically built on an illusion of mutual obligation. The lord provided protection and the right to work the land, and in return, the peasant provided labor, loyalty, and a hefty share of their harvest. It was a neat, tidy package, often preached from the pulpit as divinely ordained. But the Little Ice Age was about to severely test this pact. When the crops failed for years on end, when the land could barely support a fraction of its population, what was the Lord's obligation? And more importantly, what was the peasant's? When there was no harvest to share, no surplus labor to provide, and the Lord's protection couldn't shield you from the relentless cold and hunger, the entire social contract began to fray. The illusion of mutual benefit dissolved under the harsh glare of starvation. Some lords, perhaps out of genuine piety or enlightened self-interest, tried to help. Many others, however, simply tightened the screws, demanding their due regardless of the suffering, accelerating the breakdown of community and fostering deep-seated resentment. It was a brutal revelation. When push came to shove, when survival was on the line, the mutual obligation was often a very one-sided affair, heavily favoring the one with the biggest castle and the sharpest swords. It wasn't like a Hollywood movie where the sky suddenly turns green and a giant wall of ice descends upon New York City. No, the onset of the Little Ice Age was far more subtle, far more insidious, like someone slowly turning down the thermostat and then forgetting to turn it back up for a few centuries. The first whispers of winter weren't blizzards. They were colder springs that lingered longer than usual, refusing to yield to the warmth. Summers felt shorter, a mere fleeting promise of sunshine before the creeping chill returned. Late frosts would suddenly descend, silently decimating budding crops, turning a promising field of green into a blackened, withered wasteland overnight. And early snowfalls, thin and tentative at first, would arrive weeks ahead of schedule, burying unharvested fields and trapping livestock. For a population deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature, these were unsettling anomalies, not a cataclysm, but a series of unsettling deviations, like a familiar song played slightly off-key. They might grumble, they might attribute it to particularly bad luck, but they couldn't possibly grasp the long-term, systemic shift that was underway. It was a global problem, manifesting as thousands of tiny, local misfortunes. Faced with these unsettling shifts, the initial human reaction was precisely what you'd expect: a hearty dose of denial, flavored with a generous dash of superstition. "Oh, it's just a bad year," they'd say, perhaps with a nervous glance at the perpetually gray sky. "God must be angry," would be another common refrain, leading to increased prayers, fasting, and desperate attempts to appease a seemingly wrathful deity. Or perhaps it was "the local witch is at it again," an accusation that often ended poorly for said local witch, regardless of her actual meteorological influence. The human tendency to resist new, uncomfortable truths, especially ones that defy all prior experience, is a powerful force. They couldn't conceive of a climate shift. Their world was static, divinely ordained. So they sought explanations within their existing framework of understanding: supernatural forces, moral failings, or simply a streak of profoundly bad luck. The burgeoning fear of the unknown began to fester, slowly eroding the thin veneer of predictability that allowed their precarious lives to function. It was easier to blame a grumpy old woman or an angry god than to accept that the very fabric of their world was changing in ways they couldn't comprehend or control. The insidious creep of climate change, medieval style, was perhaps its most dangerous aspect. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic apocalypse that would shock them into immediate, radical adaptation. Instead, it was a slow, almost imperceptible decline, a gradual erosion of the familiar that made it incredibly difficult to identify as a systemic, long-term problem rather than just a series of unlucky, unfortunate events. One bad harvest might be dismissed. Two in a row would be worrying. Three would be devastating. But when we occurred over decades, intermingled with the occasional normal year, it blurred the lines. Generations grew up experiencing slightly colder conditions than their grandparents, slowly normalizing the new, harsher reality. They couldn't look at long-term data. They only had immediate memory. This gradual nature meant that adaptation was reactive, piecemeal, and often too little, too late. It was 1,000 paper cuts rather than one swift blow, slowly bleeding the life out of their agricultural systems and their collective resilience. The climate wasn't shouting. It was whispering a death sentence, and they were too busy shivering to hear it properly. When we talk about the Little Ice Age, the immediate image is often one of snow and ice. But especially in its early phases, particularly in regions like Northern Europe during the early 14th century, it was more than just cold. It was relentlessly, pervasively wet. Imagine not just chilly air, but a constant, soul-drenching drizzle that seemed to fall from the heavens like a perpetual, weeping curse. For months, sometimes even years on end, the rains came and they stayed. Fields, once fertile, became waterlogged, sodden bogs, making planting an impossible slog. The heavy clay soils, already difficult to work, turned into an impassable, sticky quagmire. Seeds, if they were even sown, simply rotted in the ground before they had a chance to germinate. Existing crops, battered by the incessant downpour, turned to mush, their delicate stalks unable to withstand the ceaseless assault. This wasn't just cold, this was wet cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there, just like your landlord's oppressive gaze or the memory of that one embarrassing thing you did in 3rd grade. It was a chilling, damp misery that permeated everything, turning a struggle for survival into a struggle against a relentlessly soggy, utterly miserable environment. The immediate consequence of this relentless deluge was, predictably, widespread crop failure. With fields too waterlogged to plant, or with planted seeds simply rotting, the expected harvests vanished. The few crops that did manage to push through the sodden earth often failed to ripen, remaining stunted, sickly, and largely inedible. What wasn't drowned or rotted was vulnerable to a host of plant diseases that thrived in the damp conditions, further decimating yields. But the misery didn't stop there. The constant, wet, cold conditions were also a breeding ground for animal diseases. Livestock, already struggling with reduced fodder and exposure, fell victim to various blights and pestilences. Sheep, vital for wool and meat, died in droves. Cattle, essential for milk, meat, and more critically, as draft animals for plowing, perished from exposure and disease. Pigs, the medieval equivalent of a living savings account, succumbed to illness. It was a devastating double whammy for the food supply. Not only were the fields barren, but the barns were empty, and the pastures silent. The very foundation of their existence was being systematically dismantled by an indifferent, weeping sky. This initial phase of persistent bad weather, this seemingly endless deluge, combined with a creeping cold, wasn't just an isolated series of unfortunate events. It was, in grim retrospect, the setting of the stage for something far, far worse. It was the dress rehearsal for the big one, the catastrophe that would etch itself into the historical record as one of the most brutal famines in European history, the Great Famine of 1315-1317. The years of diminished harvests, of weakened livestock, of a population already teetering on the brink of subsistence had systematically eroded any reserves, any resilience, any margin for error that these communities might have possessed. Their granaries were empty, their fields infertile, their animals sickly, and their spirits frayed. They were already malnourished, already cold, already deeply anxious. All it would take was one more push, one more relentless season of misery to send them tumbling into the abyss. And the Little Ice Age, like a particularly cruel stage manager, was about to deliver that push, unleashing a wave of suffering that would redefine the meaning of brutal for an entire continent. All right, strap in, because this is where the dark humor really gets a workout. You thought things were bad before? Welcome to the Great Famine of 1315-1317, a pivotal, utterly horrifying event that serves as a grim historical interlude, directly linked to the early onset of the Little Ice Age. This wasn't just a bad year or a tight squeeze. This was a full-blown, continent-wide climate catastrophe, a multi-year disaster that brought mass starvation, widespread death, and a dramatic, terrifying societal breakdown. For context, imagine a global pandemic, but instead of a virus, the enemy is a relentlessly cold, wet, and utterly barren world. The rains that began in 1315 simply refused to stop. Fields became unworkable swamps. Crops failed universally. Food prices skyrocketed, far beyond the reach of the common peasant. The very fabric of society began to unravel under the relentless pressure of primal hunger. Turns out, starving to death isn't very funny. But we'll try to find the dark humor in humanity's desperate, horrifying descent into the primal, where every scrap of sustenance became a matter of life and death, and where the boundaries of human decency began to blur into a truly disturbing landscape. The Great Famine wasn't just about hunger. It was about the utter breakdown of social norms, a descent into the kind of desperation that forces humanity to confront its darkest potential. As food reserves dwindled, and then vanished, as starvation gripped entire communities, the unthinkable became merely possible. Rumors, and indeed verified accounts, of cannibalism began to circulate, not in some faraway, exotic land, but in the heart of Europe. People reportedly ate whatever they could find: dogs, cats, rats, horses, and in the most horrifying instances, the bodies of the recently deceased, sometimes even children. Infanticide became a desperate act for parents who couldn't bear to watch their offspring slowly waste away, or to reduce the number of mouths to feed. Parents sometimes abandoned their children, hoping someone else might be able to feed them, or simply leaving them to a mercifully swift end in the cold. People were reduced to consuming tree bark, grass, leaves, and even clay in a desperate attempt to fill their empty stomachs. The smell of starvation, a distinct, sickly sweet odor of decay and desperation, hung heavy in the air. These were the unspeakable truths, the horrifying choices forced upon people by a climate that had turned inexplicably hostile. The Great Famine was a brutal, existential test of peasant resilience, and for millions, they failed, en masse. This wasn't just a bad harvest that they could stoically endure. It was a cascading catastrophe that overwhelmed all existing coping mechanisms. Estimates suggest that between 10% and 25% of the population of Northern Europe perished during these few short years, That's millions of people, wiped out not by war or plague, but by the relentless, grinding agony of hunger and the diseases that followed closely behind. It stripped away all pretense of social order, revealing the raw, brutal core of human survival. The experience left deep psychological scars, cementing a collective memory of profound vulnerability and the arbitrary cruelty of nature. It was a grim indicator of what future, prolonged cold snaps, what subsequent failures of the harvest would mean. It taught them, in the most visceral way possible, that their lives were truly on the knife edge, and that even the good years were merely temporary reprieves from an ever-present threat of total annihilation. The Little Ice Age had made its opening statement, and it was a chilling, undeniable declaration of war on human survival. When your crops are failing, your children are starving, and the sky seems to be perpetually weeping, what do you blame? If you're a medieval peasant, scientific inquiry isn't exactly at the top of your list of diagnostic tools. There was no understanding of atmospheric science, no concept of solar minima or oceanic circulation changes. Meteorology was a branch of folklore, not science. When you don't have meteorologists, you resort to blaming anyone who looks at you funny, or lives alone with a cat, or perhaps a particularly grumpy deity. The medieval mind, for all its complexities, operated within a framework of divine will, supernatural forces, and tangible, immediate causes. The abstract concept of a global climate shift over centuries was utterly alien. So, when calamity struck, they looked for easily identifiable culprits, moral failings, malevolent magic, or the direct intervention of an angry god. It wasn't ignorance, exactly, but a deeply ingrained worldview that interpreted all phenomena through a spiritual or social lens, rather than a scientific one. This meant that the true cause of their misery remained obscured, leaving them to flail against imagined enemies, while the real, invisible adversary continued its relentless assault. For many, the relentless cold and persistent crop failures could only mean one thing: divine punishment. God, it seemed, was thoroughly displeased. What had humanity done to incur such wrath? Perhaps it was their sins, their moral failings, their general human tendency towards debauchery and avarice. The pervasive misery led to intensified religious interpretations. Priests preached sermons about penance and repentance, urging their congregations to confess their sins, to fast, to pray harder, to redouble their efforts to appease a seemingly angry, distant deity. Processions would wind through freezing villages, desperate people seeking solace and intervention from saints, making vows and offerings. Apocalyptic visions proliferated. Was this the end times foretold in Scripture? Was the world slowly grinding to a halt, a precursor to the final judgment? The psychological comfort of believing there was a reason for their suffering, even if that reason was their own culpability, was often preferable to the terrifying thought of a random, indifferent universe. It provided a framework for understanding, a pathway to potential redemption, even if it involved a lot of self-flagellation and general despair. And when divine punishment seemed too abstract, or when God simply wasn't responding to their fervent prayers, there was always a more tangible, local target for blame: the scapegoat. The unpredictable weather, the failed harvests, the inexplicable deaths, all could be attributed to malevolent forces, to human agents of evil. And who better to blame than those who already stood outside the norm? Witches, often elderly women living alone, healers, or those simply regarded with suspicion, became convenient targets. If God wasn't to blame, then it must be the local sorceress, stirring up foul weather with her dark magic. Heretics, those who challenged the established religious doctrine, were also seen as inviting divine displeasure, their very existence potentially cursing the entire community. The predictable rise in witch hunts and the persecution of marginalized groups during periods of intense suffering is a chilling testament to humanity's need to find a concrete enemy, even when the real enemy is an invisible, imperceptible shift in global climate. Spoiler alert, burning a cat or an accused witch does not improve the harvest. It just makes the problem smell worse and adds another layer of human cruelty to an already devastating situation. But in their desperation, any action, however irrational, felt better than passive suffering. The subtle, insidious shift in climate during the Little Ice Age had a very tangible, very brutal quantitative impact on agriculture. We're not talking about a slight dip. We're talking about plummeting crop yields across Europe, a slow, grinding decline that made the struggle for survival a permanent state. Fields that once reliably produced enough grain to feed a village now struggled to yield even half that. Take, for instance, the cultivation of grapes for wine. For centuries, vineyards had flourished in regions of England, producing surprisingly decent vintages. But as the cold set in, the growing season became too short, the frosts too frequent, and the average temperatures too low. Grape cultivation, slowly but surely, retreated southwards, abandoning its northernmost outposts. This wasn't just an inconvenience for wine connoisseurs. It was a visible, undeniable sign of a fundamental change in the climate, shrinking the agricultural footprint of entire regions. The land itself was becoming less productive, less generous, slowly turning its back on the human populations that depended entirely upon its bounty. Every year, less grain in the granaries, fewer vegetables in the plots, and a growing, desperate awareness that the land was simply no longer enough. The impact of shrinking yields wasn't a standalone problem. It created a devastating chain reaction, a vicious cycle of scarcity that spiraled downwards into deeper and deeper poverty. Less food for people meant, critically, less fodder for animals. When you're struggling to feed your family, you can't afford to lavish precious grain on your livestock. This led to fewer draft animals, horses and oxen, essential for plowing and transport, meaning less land could be cultivated efficiently, further depressing future yields. Less fodder also meant weaker, sicker animals, resulting in fewer births and increased deaths, particularly during the harsh winters. Fewer animals meant less manure, a crucial natural fertilizer for maintaining soil fertility. So the soil itself became less productive, compounding the problem. It was a perfect storm of interconnected failures. Reduced yields, leading to weaker animals, leading to less efficient farming, leading to even further reduced yields. A slow, grinding agony of reduced productivity, leading inevitably to chronic hunger, malnutrition, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness. Each problem fed into the next, amplifying the misery and tightening the noose around peasant communities. For a population already living on the knife edge of subsistence, the math of scarcity was a cruel, undeniable reality. Imagine a peasant family whose existence hinges on producing, say, 100 units of grain to survive the year, feeding themselves, their animals, paying the Lord. If a good year saw them produce 120 units, that 20-unit surplus might allow for a tiny bit of trade, a small reserve, or perhaps even a meager feast. But if the Little Ice Age brought a mere 10–20% drop in yield, that 120 units suddenly becomes 96 to 108 units, below the threshold of survival. A 10% drop, which sounds minor in a climate report, meant widespread death for a population with no margin. It meant the difference between making it through winter and watching your family slowly waste away. This wasn't abstract economics. It was a brutal, tangible calculation playing out in every household, every village, every region. A 20% drop was an absolute death sentence for millions, and precisely what Europe experienced during the Great Famine. The mathematical certainty of starvation was a specter that haunted every peasant, every season, a cold, hard truth that no amount of prayer or toil could fully escape. While human suffering during the Little Ice Age tends to get most of the historical spotlight, let's not forget the silent sufferers, the livestock. Their lives were already brutal, full of hard labor, questionable living conditions, and the ever-present threat of becoming someone's dinner. But the prolonged cold and damp made things exponentially worse. We're talking fewer births, as animals struggled to conceive and carry young in the harsh conditions. Increased deaths from sheer exposure, as their meager shelters offered little protection from the freezing winds and relentless snow. Lack of adequate fodder, as pastures froze and hay harvests plummeted, meant animals slowly starved even if they avoided the cold. And widespread disease, as damp, crowded conditions became breeding grounds for all manner of bovine and ovine blights. Your sheep, once a source of precious wool and occasional meat, were now susceptible to rot and pneumonia. Your cattle, the engines of your farm, grew thin and listless, their milk drying up. Your most valuable assets, the very foundation of your meager wealth, were slowly but surely turning into frozen, sickly liabilities. It was a bleak pastoral tableau where every animal was a gamble, a desperate investment in a future that looked increasingly grim. Among the myriad miseries of livestock loss, the decline of draft animals was a particularly crippling blow. Horses and oxen were not just animals. They were the heavy machinery of the medieval farm. Without them, plowing became an almost insurmountable task, drastically reducing the amount of land that could be cultivated. Imagine trying to prepare a vast field for planting using only human muscle power. It's a slow, agonizing process, physically impossible to sustain on the scale required to feed a village. The loss of a single ox or horse wasn't just an economic setback. It was a fundamental attack on the very capacity of a peasant family, or even an entire village, to produce food. It meant less land tilled, fewer crops grown, and a direct, immediate intensification of human labor. Peasants were already working to their physical limits. Now, they were forced to shoulder even more of the burden, effectively becoming human oxen, pulling plows through frozen earth, their bodies protesting with every agonizing step. The loss of these animals didn't just hurt, it crippled the agricultural engine, ensuring a downward spiral of declining productivity and increasing human misery. In the face of relentless starvation, the heartbreaking decision to slaughter precious livestock for survival became all too common. These weren't just animals, they were an investment, a source of future milk, wool, labor, and offspring. But when your children's bellies were empty and your own strength was fading, that investment quickly became a last resort meal. The beloved family pig, destined for future bacon and lard, was sacrificed not for a feast, but for a few days of meager sustenance. The scrawny chickens that provided precious eggs were consumed. It was a grim calculus of immediate survival over long-term sustainability, a desperate, cannibalistic act against your own future. And then there was the practice of bringing animals indoors for warmth. Your home, already a cramped, smoky, drafty affair, now shared with a cow, a pig, or a few sheep. Practical, certainly, offering a tiny bit of animal body heat to ward off the chill. But imagine the hygiene, the smells, the parasites, the diseases. Your best friend just became your emergency ration and your indoor heater, and quite possibly the source of your next agonizing illness. It was the circle of life, medieval style, reduced to its most brutal, desperate, and utterly unglamorous essentials. Let's talk about medieval peasant homes. They were, to put it mildly, not built for comfort, and certainly not for a sustained, centuries-long cold snap. Your shed, the one where you store your rusty lawnmower and questionable gardening tools, is probably better insulated than their entire house. We're talking wattle and daub walls, a mix of woven branches, wattle, and mud, clay, and straw, daub. Not exactly R-value insulation. Thatch roofs, while surprisingly effective at keeping out rain when properly maintained, were glorified piles of straw, letting heat escape like a politician avoids accountability. Dirt floors were, well, dirt floors. Damp, cold, and a constant source of mud and various microbes. These homes were designed for temperate climates, for a world where winter was a temporary, if uncomfortable guest, not a permanent, uninvited tenant. They were drafty, prone to damp, and utterly inadequate for persistent, soul-crushing cold that seemed to seep in through every crack and crevice. Imagine living in a glorified barn that always smelled faintly of wet dog, smoke, and existential dread. That was their reality. And it was about to get a whole lot colder. Faced with the relentless chill, peasants engaged in desperate, often futile, attempts at insulation. Think of it as primitive, low-budget home improvement, driven by the immediate threat of hypothermia. More straw would be piled onto the thatch roofs, creating a thicker, if still porous, barrier against the elements. Mud and clay were liberally slathered onto existing walls, trying to seal cracks and add a smidgen of thermal mass. Windows, if they even had them, often just unglazed holes in the wall, would be sealed with wooden shutters, animal hides, or even more wattle and daub, plunging the interior into perpetual gloom. It was a constant battle against drafts, against the pervasive damp that condensed on every cold surface, and against the freezing interiors that made simply existing a painful endurance test. Every crack was a portal for cold, every gap a personal insult from Mother Nature. These were not sophisticated renovations. They were desperate, reactive measures, often temporary fixes that barely made a dent in the overwhelming problem. It was like trying to stop a leaky sieve with a single, very tired finger. You might slow it down, but the water's still getting through, and you're still soaking wet. And when all else failed, when the straw and mud proved insufficient, when your own body heat was rapidly dissipating into the freezing air, there was one desperate, practical, albeit incredibly unhygienic, solution: Bring in the livestock. Sharing your already cramped, smoky, drafty dwelling with a cow, a pig, or a few sheep wasn't a choice born of affection. It was a cold, hard calculation of survival. Animal bodies, with their higher metabolic rates and furry exteriors, generate a surprising amount of heat. A few cows could literally raise the internal temperature of a peasant dwelling by a few precious degrees, making the difference between a miserable night and a deadly one. But imagine the consequences. The smells. Dear God, the smells. The constant lowing and snorting. The manure, piled up inside or just outside the door. The parasites, the fleas, the lice, the diseases that could jump from animal to human with alarming ease. Your best friend wasn't just your emergency ration and your indoor heater, it was also a biological hazard. It was the ultimate medieval hack, a testament to the fact that when faced with existential cold, human ingenuity will prioritize warmth and survival over almost any consideration of comfort, cleanliness, or common sense. The proximity to animals brought its own set of problems, but at least you were slightly less frozen. Before the Little Ice Age, firewood was, of course, essential for cooking, for a bit of warmth, for light. But when the cold set in for centuries, the demand for fuel didn't just increase, it went exponential. Imagine the difference between needing a fire for a few hours in the evening versus needing one burning almost constantly, day and night, for months on end. More prolonged cold meant needing fires for longer periods, consuming vast amounts of wood at a rate that local forests simply couldn't sustain. Forget gold. The real currency, the true measure of wealth, was dry, seasoned wood, and everyone was perpetually broke. Your ability to survive the winter hinged directly on your ability to procure and store enough fuel, a task that became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The very air around you, once filled with the scent of burgeoning spring, now carried the heavy, constant smell of wood smoke, a telltale sign of a population desperately clinging to warmth, literally burning through their natural resources. It was a struggle for warmth that consumed not just wood, but time, energy, and ultimately, hope. The insatiable demand for firewood led to predictable and devastating consequences: rapid deforestation. Local forests, once abundant and seemingly endless, were systematically stripped bare. Trees that had stood for centuries were felled and burned, often faster than they could regrow. This led to longer, more arduous, and infinitely more dangerous journeys for wood gathering. Peasants would have to venture further and further from their villages into wilder, less safe territories, exposing themselves to the elements, to wild animals, and to the wrath of the local lord if they were caught poaching wood from his designated hunting grounds. Competition for these dwindling resources became fierce, often leading to conflicts, disputes, and even violence between neighboring communities. The landscape itself was being transformed, denuded of its protective tree cover, making it even more susceptible to the biting winds and erosion. What was once a readily available resource, part of the natural cycle, became a precious, contested commodity, a symbol of desperate scarcity and environmental degradation, all driven by the simple, primal need for warmth. And then, of course, there were the inherent dangers of those precious indoor fires, the very heart of the peasant home. Medieval homes often lacked proper chimneys, relying instead on a simple hole in the roof to let out smoke, or sometimes just allowing it to slowly seep through the thatch. This meant interiors were frequently filled with thick, acrid wood smoke, leading to chronic respiratory problems. Imagine spending your entire life inhaling particulate matter. It's not exactly a recipe for a long, healthy life, even by medieval standards. Smoke inhalation, persistent coughs, burning eyes, and black lungs were just part of the price of warmth. But even more terrifying was the constant threat of fire. A misplaced spark, a falling ember, or an unattended flame in a building constructed almost entirely of dry wood and thatch was a recipe for disaster. Entire villages could, and did, burn to the ground in a matter of hours, taking with them the only shelter and meager possessions their inhabitants owned. So, while a roaring fire offered a momentary reprieve from the cold, it also represented a constant, dangerous balancing act, a Faustian bargain with the very element that kept them alive. Wood shortage? Time to burn the furniture, or your neighbor's fence. Desperate times, desperate interior design. When you're facing a centuries-long deep freeze, your wardrobe becomes a matter of life and death, not fashion. And for the medieval peasant, options were severely limited. We're talking basic, utilitarian materials: wool, linen, and occasionally leather. Wool, bless its itchy, scratchy heart, was the king of cold weather wear. It's naturally insulating, even when damp, making it superior to linen for warmth. But it was often coarse, poorly processed, and rarely as soft as the merino wool you might find at your local outdoor gear store. Linen, made from flax, was lighter and more comfortable against the skin, good for undergarments, but offered little protection against deep cold. Leather, from cows, sheep, or pigs, was tough and wind-resistant, but heavy, stiff, and required extensive processing. The entire process of making fabric, from shearing sheep or harvesting flax to spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and then sewing garments, was slow, labor-intensive, and entirely done by hand. There were no synthetic materials, no Gore-Tex, no down jackets. Just raw animal and plant fibers transformed into rough, simple garments through monumental effort. Every stitch was an investment in survival. Every layer a testament to their desperate need to stay warm. In a world of scarcity, where every scrap of material was precious, fast fashion was not just a foreign concept, it was an absurdity. Their fashion sense was more like slow, miserable, wear it until it disintegrates fashion. Every garment was a lifelong companion, constantly patched, darned, and remade until it was literally threadbare beyond recognition. A tunic might be mended countless times, its original color obscured by layers of patches from other worn-out clothes. When a garment was finally too far gone to wear, it wouldn't be discarded. Oh no, it would be repurposed. Strips of fabric might be used as rags, insulation, or even incorporated into new, Frankenstein-esque garments. Sleeves from an old tunic might become leggings. A worn cloak might be cut down into blankets. Nothing was wasted. This wasn't just frugality. It was a fundamental survival strategy, a recognition that every fiber represented labor, resources, and a precious barrier against the elements. Their clothes were less about style and more about stubborn, utilitarian endurance, a patchwork testament to a life lived on the absolute edge of material existence. Given the limited materials, the primary survival strategy for dressing was, unsurprisingly, layering. As many layers as could possibly be scrounged together, piled one on top of the other to trap precious pockets of body heat. A linen shift against the skin, then a wool tunic, perhaps another, then a thick wool overtunic, and finally a cloak. Leggings, if one was lucky, and crude, often ill-fitting leather shoes or boots stuffed with straw or rags. This meant perpetually wearing multiple layers of whatever was available, often damp, often smelly, and always uncomfortable. Imagine the chafing. Imagine the difficulty of movement. Imagine the sheer weight of sodden wool. Fashion sense? More like survive this week and avoid amputation sense. The discomfort was immense, but the alternative was frostbite, hypothermia, and death. And in their desperate bid for warmth, cleanliness often took a backseat. Clothes were rarely washed, as water was precious, heat for drying was scarce, and soap was a luxury. So the layers that kept them warm also became repositories for grime, sweat, and various unpleasant odors, a testament to the fact that when it's a choice between smelling bad and freezing to death, most people will opt for the olfactory offense. When your carefully cultivated fields become frozen mud pits or waterlogged swamps, and your granaries are emptier than a medieval bathhouse in winter, where do you turn? The forest, the wild. The untamed parts of the landscape that, in better times, were often seen as dangerous or simply a source of supplementary goods. With farming failing, the reliance on wild resources skyrocketed, transforming foraging from an occasional activity into a vital, full-time, desperate hunt for sustenance. Berries, if you could find them before the birds or other hungry creatures did. Nuts, if the squirrels hadn't beaten you to them and the harvest wasn't frozen. Wild greens, herbs, and roots, once perhaps an interesting addition to pottage, now became the main course. Mushrooms, both edible and, unfortunately, often poisonous, were sought with desperate hope. When your crops freeze and your livestock dwindle, the weeds suddenly look delicious. Bon appetit, you hardy, desperate future ancestor of yours. It was a stark reminder that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, humanity's primal hunter-gatherer instincts were always just a failed harvest away. Foraging, however, was no stroll through a quaint country garden. It was fraught with dangers, each one a potential death sentence. First, the risk of poisoning. Identifying edible versus poisonous plants was a skill passed down through generations, but under pressure, mistakes happened. A misidentified mushroom could lead to agonizing death. A toxic berry could fell an entire family. Then there were the predators. With diminished food sources, wild animals like wolves, bears, and even wild boars became more desperate and aggressive, viewing a solitary forager as an easy meal. The deep snows and freezing conditions also made travel treacherous, increasing the risk of hypothermia or injury in remote areas. And finally, the most human of dangers, punishment. Much of the wild land, especially forests, was technically owned by the Lord, reserved for his hunting and timber. Poaching, even for mere survival, was a grave crime, punishable by brutal mutilation, imprisonment, or even death. So every berry picked, every root dug, every mushroom gathered was a deadly gamble, a desperate calculation of risk versus reward, with the stakes being nothing less than your own life and the survival of your family. As more and more people turned to foraging, the natural consequence was a rapid, often irreversible, depletion of local wild food sources. What little the forests and fields could offer was quickly exhausted by the sheer number of hungry mouths. Areas that once provided a modest bounty were stripped bare, pushing foragers further and further afield, into more dangerous and unfamiliar territories. This created a tragic feedback loop. The greater the need, the more intense the foraging. The faster the depletion, the deeper the hunger, and the more desperate the search. It was a race against time, a desperate scramble to find sustenance before winter stripped the land bare, before the meager wild plants withered, and before the nuts and berries were gone. This wasn't a sustainable practice. It was a desperate emergency measure that further destabilized the delicate ecological balance, turning once resourceful communities into hungry hordes, scavenging the last scraps from an increasingly barren and hostile landscape. The forest, once a generous provider, was slowly being bled dry by the very people it was trying to save. Welcome to the Hunger Games Medieval Edition, where the arena is your freezing village and the prize is not dying this week. As resources dwindled and the constant threat of starvation became a grim reality, the thin veneer of community solidarity began to erode, revealing the raw, brutal instinct for self-preservation. Suddenly, your neighbor wasn't just good old Farmer Giles. He was a competitor for the last patch of edible weeds, for the firewood you both desperately needed, or for the scrawny chicken that looked less like a pet and more like tomorrow's questionable protein. Petty theft escalated into raiding neighboring fields. Disputes over foraging grounds turned violent, and the unspoken rules of communal living shattered under the immense pressure of hunger. Children, driven by empty bellies, might steal a turnip. Adults, driven by desperation, might eye a neighbor's meager stores with predatory intent. The concept of shared suffering often gave way to the harsh reality of individual survival, where every man, woman, and child was locked in a silent, desperate battle for the last crumb. In this grim contest, it was truly survival of the fittest, peasant style. But fittest didn't always mean strongest. It meant most cunning, most ruthless, or simply most lucky. Families, the bedrock of medieval society, began to fracture under the strain. The elderly and the infirm, those who couldn't contribute to the relentless scramble for food, were often abandoned or left to succumb to the elements and starvation. It was a horrifying calculus of resource allocation. Who would get the last mouthful of gruel? The strong, who could work and contribute, or the weak, who were already fading? These were the grim choices forced upon people by sheer, unrelenting desperation, choices that would haunt them, if they survived, for the rest of their short lives. There was no social welfare safety net, no food banks, no government aid, just the stark, brutal reality of a world that had seemingly decided to weed out the weak, leaving only those hardened enough or desperate enough to endure. The bonds of kinship and community were stretched to their breaking point, revealing the primal, terrifying core of human nature when pushed to its absolute limits. When starvation looms large, the lines of morality, once so clearly delineated by religious doctrine and social custom, become hopelessly blurred. What crimes are unforgivable when the alternative is watching your children die a slow, agonizing death? Is stealing a loaf of bread from a wealthy merchant a sin or an act of necessary survival? Is abandoning a sick family member an act of cruelty or a desperate attempt to save the rest of the family? The moral landscape of the Little Ice Age was a treacherous gray area where people were forced to make choices that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. Acts of kindness and compassion still occurred, certainly, but they were often overshadowed by the brutal necessities of survival. The constant gnawing hunger, the freezing cold, the pervasive fear. These were powerful forces that could warp even the most virtuous soul. May the odds be ever not in your favor, because you're a peasant, and the odds were never in your favor to begin with. This was a world where ethics were luxuries, and survival was the only commandment that truly mattered, no matter the cost to one's soul or one's conscience. When all else fails, when your crops are frozen, your livestock are dying, and your belly is emptier than a nobleman's promise, what do? You pray. Harder. Much, much harder. The Little Ice Age saw a dramatic intensification of religious rituals as desperate peasants sought any glimmer of divine intervention in a world that seemed utterly hostile. More processions would wind through snow-covered fields, villagers carrying relics, chanting litanies, hoping to appease an angry god or to invoke the mercy of a saint. Vows were made to patron saints, promising fervent devotion or pilgrimages, if one survived, in exchange for a bountiful harvest or simply a merciful end to the cold. Offerings, however meager, were brought to local churches, desperate pleas for deliverance. The church, for all its faults, remained the central institution, the only source of hope and explanation in an incomprehensible world. When you lack scientific understanding and practical solutions, you turn to the spiritual, seeking comfort and control where none seems to exist. It was a desperate search for meaning, for a glimmer of hope, in the face of relentless, indifferent suffering. Even if, from a purely objective standpoint, prayer didn't magically thaw the fields or make the grain grow, the act itself offered profound psychological comfort. In a world utterly beyond their control, the act of prayer provided a sense of agency, a feeling that they were at least doing something, actively engaging with the forces that governed their fate. It offered solace, a moment of quiet contemplation amidst the chaos, a brief respite from the gnawing fear. Community prayer, the shared act of supplication, also served as a powerful unifying force, helping to maintain some semblance of social order and solidarity in communities teetering on the brink of collapse. It reminded them they were not alone in their suffering, that others shared their plight and their faith. Even if it didn't change the weather, it helped them cope with the unbearable reality of it, providing a framework of meaning and a fragile thread of hope that allowed them to put one foot in front of the other, day after freezing day. Praying for warmth isn't very efficient, but it's cheap, and the sermon helps pass the time before you freeze. But this intensification of piety also placed an immense burden on the clergy. How do you explain God's seemingly endless wrath? How do you offer comfort and hope when the suffering is so pervasive, so relentless, and so utterly unresponsive to all prayers? Priests and bishops struggled to interpret the continuous stream of misfortunes. Sermons often focused on sin, repentance, and the fragility of human existence, urging greater piety as the only path to eventual salvation. Some may have preached that suffering was a test of faith, others that it was a cleansing fire, preparing humanity for the second coming. It was a delicate balancing act, maintaining the authority of the church and the belief in a benevolent, if stern, God, while confronted with undeniable, widespread misery that seemed to contradict those very tenets. For the common peasant, however, the explanations mattered less than the hope, however faint, that somewhere, somehow, their prayers would eventually be heard, and the sun would return, bringing warmth and bounty back to their increasingly frozen world. Until then, they would simply shiver, pray, and try not to lose faith entirely. As if the relentless cold and pervasive hunger weren't enough, the Little Ice Age brought an even more insidious companion: widespread disease. The constant malnutrition suffered by the peasant population systematically weakened their immune systems, turning what might have been a minor sniffle into a deadly pneumonia. Chronic hunger meant bodies lacked the essential nutrients to fight off infections, to repair damaged tissues, or even to produce enough body heat. This created a vicious cycle. Hunger led to weakness, weakness led to susceptibility to illness, illness led to further weakness and inability to work, which then exacerbated hunger. It was a perfect, brutal feedback loop of suffering, where every ailment was magnified, every infection a potential death sentence. Imagine trying to fight off a bad cold when your body is already running on empty, shivering perpetually, and your only medicine is a questionable herbal concoction. The body's natural defenses, constantly under siege from cold and starvation, simply crumpled under the onslaught, leaving its host utterly vulnerable to whatever microscopic horrors decided to take root. In the damp, cold, and crowded conditions of medieval peasant homes, respiratory illnesses became endemic and often deadly. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and common colds, which modern medicine can often cure with a simple antibiotic or even just rest, turned into relentless killers. Huddled together for warmth, sharing the same air, often thick with smoke from indoor fires, weakened bodies were ideal breeding grounds for the rapid spread of airborne pathogens. A cough in one corner of the cramped cottage quickly became a hacking chorus throughout the entire family. The pervasive dampness exacerbated lung conditions, and the constant exposure to cold only further weakened the body's ability to recover. As if starvation wasn't enough, here's a plague of snot, coughs, and agonizing death from lungs filled with fluid. Enjoy! It was a miserable, suffocating reality, where the simple act of breathing became a painful reminder of their vulnerability, and the sound of a persistent cough was often a harbinger of imminent demise. The cold wasn't just freezing them to death, it was inviting every nasty bug to come and finish the job. Beyond respiratory infections, the prolonged cold of the Little Ice Age brought a host of other specific, agonizing ailments. Frostbite, the cruelest of all, turning extremities, fingers, toes, noses, ears, black and gangrenous, often necessitating gruesome, unanesthetized amputations if a village elder or a passing barber surgeon had been nerve to perform them. Trench foot, or immersion foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions, led to the decay of foot tissue, making walking agonizing and often leading to infection and amputation. Hypothermia, the rapid, uncontrolled loss of body heat, was a constant, silent killer, especially for the very young, the very old, and the very weak. All of these conditions were exacerbated by poor clothing, inadequate nutrition, and the sheer lack of proper shelter. Medieval medicine, already rudimentary at best, was utterly incapable of treating these severe cold-related conditions. There were no antibiotics, no modern wound care, no understanding of sterile technique. So, the misery of the cold was compounded by the physical agony of decaying flesh, infected wounds, and the grim reality that a simple shiver could easily escalate into a death sentence. It might seem like an odd pivot, discussing the Black Death in the context of an ice age, but bear with me, because there's a dark, undeniable connection. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe from 1347 to 1351, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of the population, didn't happen in a vacuum. It struck a continent already severely weakened and vulnerable. Remember the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317? Those generations, those who survived, were permanently scarred. Their bodies were malnourished, their immune systems compromised, their resilience eroded. Chronic hunger and persistent cold had systematically worn down the population, making them far more susceptible to the plague when it eventually arrived. It was like a boxing match where one fighter has already been pummeled for rounds before the main event even begins. While the Black Death's peak actually occurred during a temporary warming trend in some regions, because Mother Nature loves to keep things complicated, the preceding decades of climate instability and famine had created a demographic tinderbox ready to ignite with terrifying speed. The Little Ice Age didn't cause the Black Death, but it certainly set the stage for its devastating impact, ensuring a pre-weakened population for the plague to gleefully decimate. Now for the truly dark, almost unsettlingly sarcastic take on historical causality. The Black Death, for all its horror, had an unintended, chilling silver lining from a purely Malthusian perspective. Turns out, fewer mouths to feed is one way to solve resource scarcity. Just not a very pleasant one. With a significant portion of the European population simply ceasing to exist, the pressure on land and resources, which had been stretched to its absolute breaking point by centuries of population growth and the early onset of the Little Ice Age, suddenly eased. There was, quite literally, more food and land per survivor. This isn't to say it was a good thing. Far from it. It was an unimaginable catastrophe. But in the cold, hard calculus of historical trends, it did, in its own horrifying way, temporarily rebalance the human-to-resource ratio. It's the kind of grim, dispassionate observation that history sometimes forces upon us, making us question the very meaning of progress and survival. It's the universe's most brutal, indiscriminate form of population control, a Malthusian nightmare come to life, allowing the remaining, shell-shocked survivors a momentary, terrifying reprieve. The Black Death, fueled in part by a population weakened by climate-induced famine, created profound social and economic shifts that indirectly impacted future resilience, even as the Little Ice Age continued its slow creep. With millions dead, there was a sudden, unprecedented labor shortage. Landowners, desperate for hands to work their fields, were forced to offer better wages and conditions to the surviving peasants. Serfdom, the system of feudal bondage, began its slow, painful decline as peasants gained newfound bargaining power and mobility. This wasn't a revolution born of idealism, but of brute demographic reality. For the first time, peasants had leverage. They could demand more, sometimes even escape to towns, which were often desperate for labor. This shift meant that subsequent generations of peasants, while still facing the ongoing challenges of the Little Ice Age, did so with slightly more economic agency, slightly more freedom, and slightly better conditions than their pre-plague ancestors. It's an unsettling thought that sometimes, out of the darkest, most unimaginable suffering, can emerge a flicker of something resembling progress, albeit forged in the fires of global catastrophe. As the Little Ice Age truly dug its icy claws into Europe, one of the most immediate and profound impacts was on the waterways. Rivers and lakes, which served as the crucial highways of the medieval world, suddenly found themselves frozen solid for extended, unprecedented periods. Think of the Rhine, the Seine, the Thames, the Volga. These were the arteries of commerce, the main routes for transporting grain, timber, livestock, and people between towns and villages. Now, imagine these vital lifelines completely, utterly, and reliably frozen over for months on end. Your Amazon Prime delivery from the next village, which was already a week late and probably just a sack of questionable oats, is now a frozen, impassable obstacle course. Sorry, your grain is delayed, indefinitely. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental disruption of the very infrastructure of their economy. The slow, cumbersome nature of land transport meant that water was king, and now the king was encased in ice. The freezing of these vital waterways plunged countless communities into isolation. Villages that once relied on river traffic for supplies, for trade, or even just for news from the outside world, suddenly found themselves cut off. Imagine being utterly disconnected, trapped in your increasingly cold and food-scarce village with no way for help to reach you and no way to reach help. This isolation exacerbated local food shortages. If one region had a slightly better harvest, it couldn't be easily transported to a starving neighbor. Aid, even if it were available, which it often wasn't, couldn't arrive. The psychological effect of being truly alone, of feeling abandoned by the wider world, must have been profound. Rumors spread like wildfire, unchecked by accurate information, fostering fear and paranoia. It was like being stuck in a never-ending lockdown, but with no Netflix, no internet, and a rapidly dwindling supply of gruel. The very boundaries of their world, once defined by the reach of the river, suddenly shrank to the immediate, frozen confines of their isolated village. The impact on trade was, predictably, catastrophic. Peasants, while largely self-sufficient, still relied on periodic markets for essential goods they couldn't produce themselves: salt for preservation, iron for tools, perhaps a bit of cloth or a rare luxury item. But with rivers frozen and land travel made even more difficult and dangerous by deep snow and ice, these markets often ceased to function. The supply chains, already tenuous and localized, snapped under the strain. Merchants couldn't transport their wares, and peasants couldn't sell their dwindling surplus or acquire necessary goods. This meant not only a lack of essential supplies, but also a collapse of the small, vibrant local economies. What little opportunity existed for upward mobility, or even just a slight improvement in living conditions, evaporated. The world, already contracting under the pall of cold and hunger, became even smaller, more insular, and more fundamentally impoverished. The disruption of trade didn't just affect the economy. It affected the very morale of a population already struggling to find any reason for hope in a world that seemed determined to freeze them into submission. In a grimly fascinating twist, the freezing of major rivers wasn't always just a source of misery. Sometimes it became a spectacle, a bizarre, almost defiant celebration of human resilience in the face of nature's indifference. We're talking about the legendary events known as frost fairs, most famously on the River Thames in London. Imagine a river, for centuries a bustling artery of trade, suddenly turning into a solid, impenetrable sheet of ice thick enough to support thousands of people, animals, and entire makeshift structures. This happened with shocking regularity during the deepest phases of the Little Ice Age. It was an anomaly so profound, so utterly out of the ordinary, that people couldn't help but gawk, and then, being human, try to make a quick shilling off it. When life gives you frozen rivers, you don't make lemonade. You set up a pub on the ice and try to forget your problems, or at least numb them with some questionable ale. These frost fairs were a chaotic, vibrant, and utterly bizarre phenomenon. On the frozen Thames, you'd find pop-up pubs serving ale and roasted meats, if you were lucky enough to afford them, makeshift markets selling trinkets and food, ice skating using primitive, bone-bladed skates, skittles, bull baiting, and even entire oxen roasted whole. Printers would set up presses on the ice, offering commemorative cards to prove you were there. It was a brief, almost desperate moment of forced revelry, a collective act of defiant celebration against the crushing cold. For the common folk, it was a momentary escape from the grim realities of their existence, a chance to witness something truly extraordinary, and to partake in a fleeting, albeit freezing, carnival atmosphere. It was the human capacity to find joy, or at least distraction, even in the most dire circumstances, a defiant middle finger to the relentless cold that otherwise dominated their lives. But don't be fooled by the laughter and the ale. For all the fleeting joy, the frost fairs were, at their heart, a dark carnival of the cold. They were a symptom of a much larger, darker climate shift, a stark reminder of how profoundly the world had changed. The very river that once fed them, transported their goods, and connected their communities, was now a giant, slippery, treacherous death trap. The revelry was often fueled by desperation, a temporary escape into intoxication and spectacle to ward off the gnawing fear of starvation and hypothermia. These fairs were not celebrations of prosperity. They were stark evidence of a world thrown out of balance, a bizarre manifestation of an environment gone rogue. Celebrate the fact that the river that once fed you is now a giant, slippery death trap. Hooray! The novelty eventually wore off. The ice inevitably melted, sometimes with tragic consequences for those still on it, and the misery of the Little Ice Age returned, unbidden, to claim its due. The frost fairs were a fleeting, almost surreal interlude, a moment of collective psychological coping that only highlighted the sheer absurdity and brutality of their new, frozen normal. When the Great Famine made its initial, chilling appearance, and as the Little Ice Age settled in for the long haul, the concept of food expanded dramatically to include the utterly unthinkable. We're talking about a slow, agonizing descent down the culinary ladder, past gruel and coarse bread, to things that would make your stomach churn just thinking about them. People resorted to eating tree bark, often ground up and mixed with whatever meager flour or sawdust could be found. A gritty, indigestible, and utterly unsatisfying meal that provided almost no nutrition, but at least filled the belly with something. Roots, moss, and lichens, previously ignored or only consumed by animals, became vital, if meager, sources of sustenance. And then there was the grub. Various insects, worms, slugs, and snails were collected and eaten. Rodents, rats, mice became a protein source. desperately hunted and consumed despite the obvious risks of disease. Leather, from old shoes or belts, was boiled for hours until it became a pulpy, semi-edible mass. Tonight's special, oak bark crumble, with a hint of desperation and potential poisoning. Enjoy. It was a diet of desperation, where survival trumped all notions of palatability or even safety. The progression from bad food to barely edible, then to outright dangerous, was a terrifying one. Initially, people might scrimp, eat less, or stretch their meager provisions. Then they would turn to readily available wild plants. When those were depleted, they moved to less palatable but still technically edible things. And finally, when all else failed, they would consume anything that wouldn't immediately kill them, and sometimes even things that would, in a slow, agonizing way. The physical impact of such a diet was devastating. Chronic malnutrition, digestive issues, vitamin deficiencies, and a constant, gnawing hunger that was never truly satisfied. But the psychological impact was perhaps even worse. The constant revulsion, the daily reminder of their degradation, the sheer shame of eating things no human should ever have to eat. It eroded their humanity, pushing them closer to the animalistic, driven solely by the primal urge to survive. It was a culinary nightmare, stretching on for generations, transforming the act of eating from a pleasure or even a simple necessity into a horrifying, desperate ritual. Yet, amidst this horror, there was a strange, dark form of culinary innovation born of pure, unadulterated survival. The resourcefulness, or rather the revulsion-driven ingenuity, of finding sustenance in the most unlikely places. Peasants learned to extract whatever caloric value they could from otherwise indigestible materials. They experimented with different barks, ground up various types of nuts and seeds from wild plants, and found ways to prepare creatures that would normally be considered vermin. This wasn't about developing new recipes. It was about sheer, desperate chemistry, figuring out how to render the unpalatable barely edible. They became involuntary experts in the nutritional or anti-nutritional properties of their environment, meticulously documenting what could be eaten and what would simply hasten their demise. It was a testament to the sheer stubbornness of the human will to survive, even when that survival meant sacrificing every last vestige of comfort, dignity, and a genuinely appetizing meal. The history of food during the Little Ice Age is not a tale of culinary delight, but a harrowing chronicle of humanity's desperate ingenuity in the face of unimaginable hunger. If adult life during the Little Ice Age was a grim struggle, childhood was a relentless gauntlet of peril. For the children of winter, born into this frozen new normal, life was short, brutal, and often ended with a shiver. Infant and child mortality rates, already shockingly high in medieval times, skyrocketed during the Little Ice Age. Infants, with their fragile bodies and underdeveloped immune systems, were the most vulnerable to cold and malnutrition. A simple cough could turn into fatal pneumonia. A lack of breast milk due to a starving mother meant a rapid decline. Children between the ages of 1 and 5, often the forgotten demographic in historical records, perished in vast numbers from diseases, starvation, and exposure. Imagine a world where seeing your child reach adulthood was a rare, almost miraculous event, where grief was a constant, familiar companion, and where the cradles were all too often empty. Happy times! It was a demographic catastrophe, a silent genocide of the young, leaving behind a profound emotional scar on the survivors, perpetually haunted by the ghosts of their lost children. Those children who did manage to survive the perilous gauntlet of infancy and early childhood were often left with permanent physical scars. The long-term effects of childhood privation were profound and visible. Chronic malnutrition led to stunted growth. These generations were often noticeably shorter and physically weaker than their ancestors. Rickets, caused by a vitamin D deficiency, resulted in soft, deformed bones, leading to lifelong skeletal deformities and pain. Cognitive impairment from insufficient nutrition in critical developmental years meant a population struggling with reduced intellectual capacity. Weakened constitutions, a pervasive legacy of a childhood spent battling hunger and cold, made them even more susceptible to disease and less capable of strenuous labor as adults. It was a generation forged in frost, their bodies permanently etched with the suffering of their early years, a living testament to the brutal conditions in which they were raised. They carried the burden of the Little Ice Age, not just in their memories, but in their very bones and blood. In a world of constant scarcity, the concept of a protected childhood, a time for play and learning, was a luxury that simply could not be afforded. Children were an economic necessity, and the harsher the conditions, the earlier they were pressed into labor. As young as 5 or 6, children would be expected to contribute, undertaking tasks like scaring birds from fields, gathering firewood, fetching water, herding small animals, or helping with basic chores. As they grew older, the demands intensified, quickly joining their parents in the arduous field labor. There was no time for formal schooling, no chance for leisure, no space for the carefree innocence we associate with childhood. Their hands, still small, would be calloused and cracked, their faces prematurely aged by exposure and worry. The loss of innocence was not a gradual process. It was a swift, brutal awakening to the harsh realities of their existence. Every able-bodied, or barely able-bodied, person had to contribute to the collective survival, transforming children from cherished dependents into crucial, if diminutive, laborers, their future stolen by the relentless demands of the present. And beyond the physical toll, there was the profound psychological impact on a generation that grew up in a world of constant scarcity, death, and fear. Imagine never knowing true warmth, never having a full belly, never feeling truly secure. Imagine the constant anxiety of whether there would be enough food for tomorrow, whether winter would claim another sibling, whether the crops would fail again. This perpetual state of stress, grief, and deprivation would undoubtedly lead to deep-seated despair, depression, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness. They would witness unspeakable acts of desperation, see their loved ones waste away, and learn from a tender age that life was cheap, brutal, and fleeting. These were children who learned to accept death as a constant companion, who perhaps rarely knew genuine, sustained joy, and who were instead steeped in a pervasive atmosphere of grim resignation. The Little Ice Age didn't just freeze their bodies, it chilled their very souls, leaving an indelible mark on their collective psyche, shaping a generation hardened by suffering, cynical about hope, and eternally wary of the next cold wind. As the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, the feudal relationship between lord and peasant was put to its ultimate test. How did the lords react? It was, predictably, a mixed bag. running the gamut from grudging charity to outright rapaciousness. Some lords, perhaps out of genuine piety, or a shrewd understanding that a dead peasant produces no taxes, might offer some form of relief, temporarily reducing rents, distributing meager stores from their own granaries, or delaying labor demands. These were acts of enlightened self-interest, recognizing that their own wealth was inextricably tied to the survival of their workforce. However, many others, faced with dwindling revenues from their own estates, simply increased their demands. Rent, taxes, and labor obligations continued, often with even more vigor, despite the undeniable suffering of their tenants. Your lord wants his rent. Your crops are frozen. Good luck with that conversation. It usually ends with you being landless, headless, or at least thoroughly beaten. The common peasant was, after all, just another asset, and if one died, there was always another starving soul to take their place, at least initially. The Little Ice Age didn't create the inherent unfairness of the feudal system. It simply magnified it, projecting its brutal inequities onto a vast, freezing canvas. The system was designed to concentrate wealth and power at the top, to benefit the nobility and clergy, and a crisis merely highlighted its fundamental brutality for those at the bottom. While the peasants starved, the lords, though certainly impacted by reduced incomes, generally had reserves. They had their own granaries, their vast estates, their ability to import goods, and their access to credit. They might have to cut back on a few luxuries, perhaps scale down a feast, but they weren't facing immediate, visceral starvation. The peasant, however, lived on the brink with no safety net whatsoever. The cold, like a cruel spotlight, illuminated the vast chasm between the privileged few and the suffering masses, laying bare the hypocrisy of the mutual obligation that supposedly bound them. When the chips were down, when survival was paramount, the system was quick to reveal its true, self-serving nature, leaving the peasant to face the cold, hard truth alone. It should come as no surprise that such profound injustice, combined with relentless hunger and cold, sometimes boiled over into open rebellion. These peasant revolts, sporadic and often brutally suppressed, were not ideological revolutions seeking to overthrow the entire feudal order. They were born purely out of desperation, a primal scream against unbearable suffering. From the Jacquerie in France, 1358, to the Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381, these uprisings were fueled by land enclosures, increased taxes, and the simple, undeniable fact that people were starving while their lords lived in comparative luxury. Turns out, starving people are not very docile. Who knew? These revolts were almost always doomed to failure, lacking organization, clear leadership, and military training. They were met with overwhelming force and savage retribution, but their very existence was a stark warning, a testament to the fact that even the most oppressed can be pushed too far. The Little Ice Age, by exacerbating the already brutal inequalities of feudalism, acted as a powerful catalyst for these desperate, tragic acts of defiance, etching a grim chapter of class struggle into the annals of a cold, unforgiving history. When your fields are barren, your livestock dying, and your children are crying from hunger, what do? Sometimes you make a deadly gamble. The Lord's forests, once off-limits, reserved exclusively for his sport and table, suddenly looked less like a noble's playground and more like a potential source of salvation. The previously unthinkable act of stealing game of poaching deer, rabbits, or birds from the Lord's designated hunting grounds became a desperate life-or-death necessity. So, that magnificent stag you saw in the Lord's woods, it's not the Lord's anymore. It's a future sandwich, if you're quick, stealthy, and don't mind the distinct possibility of losing a hand, an eye, or your entire head. The laws against poaching were incredibly strict, often enforced with brutal punishments, mutilation, imprisonment, or even public execution. This wasn't a recreational activity. It was a high-stakes game of survival, played against a backdrop of feudal power and overwhelming hunger. The risks involved in poaching were immense. Not only the threat of being caught and suffering gruesome penalties from the Lord's gamekeepers, but also the inherent dangers of the hunt itself. Tracking and killing wild animals with primitive weapons like snares, bows, or even just cleverly dug pits was fraught with peril. A wounded animal could turn and attack. A misstep in the dark woods could lead to injury or death from exposure. The cold, the hunger, the constant vigilance against both man and beast. It was a physically and psychologically draining endeavor. But the thrill of success, the sheer desperate satisfaction of bringing home a rabbit, a pheasant, or, God forbid, a deer, must have been overwhelming. That fresh meat, that precious protein, meant the difference between a few more days of life and the slow, agonizing descent into starvation. It was a victory, however small and temporary, against the overwhelming forces arrayed against them, a fleeting moment of triumph that justified all the terrifying risks. In the face of relentless starvation, the clear moral lines of what was right and wrong became hopelessly blurred. When the law meant death for your family and breaking it meant life, the choice became grimly simple. Stealing from the rich, if it meant feeding your starving children, shifted from a sin to a necessary act of survival, perhaps even an act of defiance against an unjust system. The Lord's right to his game seemed less divine, more tyrannical, when that game was the only thing standing between your family and the grave. This blurring of moral boundaries led to the emergence of local folk heroes, figures like Robin Hood, albeit in a much grimier, colder context, who defied authority for the sake of their families and communities. These were not romantic figures. They were desperate men and women driven to extremes, forced to make choices that would have been unthinkable in better times. Their acts of poaching weren't about grand social justice. They were about survival, pure and simple, a stark illustration of how hunger can strip away all pretense of civility, leaving only the primal will to endure. When your village is perpetually frozen, your fields are barren, and your lord is demanding rent you can't pay, what do? You move. Or, more accurately, you are forced to move. The Little Ice Age triggered widespread, often desperate, migrations of people, transforming entire regions into medieval refugee crises on a large scale. From devastated areas, often the coldest and wettest regions, families would pick up their meager belongings and set out, seeking lands perceived as slightly less cold, slightly less wet, or offering even a sliver more abundance. Sometimes it was a seasonal migration, returning when conditions improved. More often, it was a permanent, one-way journey into the unknown, driven by the relentless whip of starvation and cold. Entire families, sometimes even small groups of villagers, would simply leave, abandoning their ancestral lands in a desperate gamble for survival. It was a bleak, relentless tide of human suffering, a silent procession of the dispossessed, seeking any haven from the climate's cruel indifference. The dangers of these forced migrations were immense, making the journey itself often as perilous as the conditions they were fleeing. Exposure was a constant, deadly threat. Traveling long distances on foot in deep snow, icy winds, and freezing temperatures could quickly lead to hypothermia and death. Starvation on the road was another grim reality. With little food to carry and few resources available along the way, many perished before reaching their destination. And even if they survived the elements, there was the hostile reception from existing communities. Welcome to the next village. We also have no food or shelter, and we despise strangers because you're just more mouths to feed and potential carriers of disease. Enjoy your stay. Migrants were often seen as a burden, a threat to already scarce resources, and were frequently met with suspicion, hostility, or outright violence. They were often forced to camp outside towns, denied entry, or exploited for desperate labor. The road was a lonely, brutal place, and the promise of a better life often turned out to be just another layer of misery. These winter migrations often became a tragic cycle of displacement. People would move from one desperate situation to another, often finding no true relief. A family fleeing famine in one region might arrive in another, only to find it already overcrowded, its resources equally strained, or its inhabitants hostile. This led to further movement, further exhaustion, further despair. The breakdown of familial and communal ties was an inevitable consequence, as families splintered, individuals becoming isolated, utterly alone in their struggle. Children were sometimes abandoned on the road, parents separated by the sheer difficulty of travel, communities dissolved under the weight of dispersal. It created a population of transients, of rootless individuals, perpetually seeking an elusive promised land that never seemed to appear. The Little Ice Age didn't just freeze the land, it froze the social fabric, shattering bonds and scattering communities, leaving a trail of displaced, desperate souls wandering a cold, unforgiving continent, forever seeking a warmth and security that rarely, if ever, came. While the physical suffering of medieval peasants during the Little Ice Age was immense, let us not forget the profound psychological toll. Imagine waking up every day to the same relentless cold, the same gnawing hunger, the same pervasive dampness. Imagine a future that looks exactly like the miserable present, stretching on endlessly. Turns out, perpetual misery isn't great for your mood. Who knew that being constantly cold, hungry, and facing imminent death would be a total bummer? Despair and depression became endemic, a silent plague of the mind. The relentless grind, the loss of loved ones, the utter helplessness in the face of nature's indifference, all combined to erode mental fortitude. Hope, that most precious of human commodities, slowly withered and died, replaced by a grim resignation, a quiet acceptance of their miserable fate. The world became a monochromatic canvas of gray, where every sunrise brought not renewed hope, but simply another day of cold, another day of hunger, another day of wondering if this would be the one that finally broke them. And when despair reached its absolute nadir, when the suffering became truly unbearable, people were sometimes driven to the most horrifying choices. While difficult to quantify in historical records, there are accounts suggesting increased instances of suicide and infanticide during periods of extreme famine and cold. These are not topics for lighthearted humor, but rather grim realities that must be acknowledged with appropriate, albeit dark, sarcasm about the depths of human suffering. Suicide, the ultimate act of desperation, became an escape for those who could no longer endure the relentless physical and psychological pain. Infanticide, the unspeakable act of taking an innocent life, was sometimes born of a perverse, desperate compassion. The desire to spare a child a slow, agonizing death from starvation, or simply to reduce the number of mouths that could not possibly be fed. These were choices made not out of malice, but out of an unimaginable, soul-crushing despair, where the pain of existing outweighed even the most primal instincts of self-preservation and parental love. It's a testament to the absolute horror of their situation that such acts became not just possible, but tragically, sometimes, a perceived necessity. Even for those who never succumbed to outright despair, the constant anxiety of survival was a relentless, pervasive burden. The fear of the next cold snap, the next failed harvest, the next outbreak of disease. It was a shadow that hung over every waking moment. Every dark cloud on the horizon, every persistent cough, every empty larder was a trigger for profound, debilitating worry. This constant state of alert, this perpetual low-level hum of terror, eroded trust, fostered suspicion, and made genuine peace of mind an impossible dream. The world, once a predictable if harsh place, had gone mad, its rhythms broken, its promises unfulfilled. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, wondering if they were next to steal a loaf of bread or accuse a witch. The very sense of community, the bedrock of medieval life, was fractured by fear and desperation. The psychological toll of the Little Ice Age was immense, leaving a lasting legacy of trauma, a deep-seated caution, and an ingrained understanding that the world was a fickle, brutal place, always ready to turn against you at a moment's notice, and all they could do was shiver and wait. In a world utterly devoid of advanced meteorology or climate science, where every season was a high-stakes gamble, peasants clung to any scrap of predictive knowledge they could find. This often manifested as a deep reliance on traditional lore, folk wisdom passed down through generations, observing the subtle, or not so subtle, cues of nature. They became amateur, desperate climatologists, scrutinizing animal behavior. If the badgers ran backward, expect a really bad Tuesday. Or maybe it's just a confused badger. If swallows flew high, good weather was coming. If low, rain was near. Cloud formations, moon cycles, the way smoke rose from a chimney, the thickness of a fur coat on an animal, the early budding of certain plants, all were carefully observed for signs, for portents, for any hint of what the fickle weather gods might have in store. This wasn't just quaint superstition, it was their primary, desperate means of trying to anticipate and prepare for an unpredictable future, a human attempt to impose order on a chaotic natural world. Now, were these primitive predictive models accurate? Well, as you might imagine, they were often hilariously, tragically wrong. The limitations of unscientific observation, coupled with a fundamentally changing climate, meant that traditional signs frequently failed to deliver. A warm autumn might promise a mild winter, only for an early blizzard to descend with devastating speed. A flock of migrating birds might signal nothing more than a local food source dwindling, rather than a continental climate shift. But by sheer chance, sometimes they got it right. And those occasional successes, those moments of accurate prediction, were powerful enough to reinforce belief in the entire system, perpetuating the folk wisdom even in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence. It was the cognitive bias of a desperate population. Remember the hits, ignore the misses. This cycle of hope and disappointment, of clinging to a fragile sense of predictability, was a cruel, almost Sisyphusian struggle against the sheer indifference of the weather. At its core, this reliance on folk wisdom and animal signs was a desperate search for predictability in an utterly unpredictable world. When you can't control the weather, you try to at least guess how much you're going to freeze tomorrow, or whether your seeds will sprout this spring. Any scrap of foreknowledge, however tenuous, however often proven wrong, was cherished as a tool for survival. It allowed them to make crucial decisions: when to plant, when to harvest, when to reinforce their homes, when to gather extra firewood. Even a bad prediction was, in a strange way, better than no prediction at all, offering a false sense of control over an uncontrollable reality. It speaks to the fundamental human need for order, for meaning, for a narrative that explains the chaos, even if that narrative is built on the flight path of a particularly anxious goose. In a world where scientific understanding was non-existent and the climate was actively turning against them, the medieval peasants' primitive predictive models were a testament to their enduring, desperate struggle for some semblance of control over their brutal existence. In the frigid landscape of the Little Ice Age, the hearth was not just a fire, it was the undisputed center of the peasant universe. It was the literal heart of the home, the pulsating core around which all life revolved. For warmth, of course, a flickering, precious ember of defiance against the biting cold. For cooking, transforming meager rations into sustenance. For light, casting flickering shadows against the rough walls, banishing the pervasive gloom of long, dark winters. And as a focal point for the family, a place for gathering, for storytelling, for sharing what little warmth and comfort could be found. It was more than just a source of heat. It was a symbol of life itself, a primal connection to survival. Without it, the peasant home would simply be a tomb of ice and despair, and its inhabitants would quickly follow. The crackle of burning wood, the earthy smell of smoke, the comforting glow, these were sensory anchors in a world of pervasive cold and darkness, offering a fragile sense of security and belonging. But this vital heart of the home came with a significant caveat: smoke. Most medieval peasant homes, especially the simpler ones, lacked proper chimneys. Instead, smoke from the central fire would often simply rise to the roof, slowly filtering out through a small hole or through the thatch itself. This meant the interior of the home was frequently, perpetually, filled with thick, acrid wood smoke. Imagine spending your entire life in a room that feels like a poorly ventilated campfire. Your lungs may fail, but at least your hands are slightly less frozen. It's a trade-off, medieval style. Chronic respiratory problems, burning eyes, coughing fits, and a general air of permanent smokiness were the price of warmth. The walls, the thatch, the clothes, the very hair of the inhabitants would be coated in a layer of soot and creosote, an ever-present reminder of their constant battle with smoke and their desperate need for heat. It was a suffocating, lung-damaging reality, where the very thing that kept them alive was simultaneously slowly killing them, a cruel paradox of peasant survival. In the face of such pervasive cold, the hearth fostered a profound, if sometimes cramped and smelly, communal aspect of living. Families, sometimes even multiple families or extended relatives, would huddle together around the meager warmth of the fire. Bodies pressed against bodies, sharing precious body heat, creating a microclimate of warmth in the otherwise freezing interior. This wasn't just practical. It was a deeply human response to shared adversity. The literal warmth of togetherness became a source of psychological comfort as well, a physical manifestation of solidarity against the encroaching cold. Stories would be told, meager meals shared, prayers whispered, all within the smoky, flickering embrace of the hearth. It was a poetic, yet sarcastic, look at the brutal necessities of communal living, where personal space was a forgotten luxury and hygiene was a distant dream. But in that huddle, in that shared warmth, was a testament to the enduring human need for connection, for companionship, even when the world outside was actively trying to freeze them into isolated despair. Even when the world was freezing, crops were failing, and death was a constant companion, one industry remained remarkably resilient: the production of alcohol. If any grain, fruit, or even wild berries could be salvaged, brewing ale or cider continued. This wasn't just for revelry, though that certainly played a part. Alcohol, especially ale, was a vital source of calories in a malnourished diet, offering precious energy when other food sources were scarce. It was also, crucially, a safer alternative to water, which was often contaminated and a breeding ground for disease. The fermentation process killed most pathogens, making ale a surprisingly healthy, comparatively speaking, hydration option. So, while you might be shivering and starving, at least you could have a pint of weak, watery ale to take the edge off. Nothing warms the soul quite like cheap, watery ale, or makes you forget your frostbite for a few glorious hours. It was a testament to humanity's persistent desire for both sustenance and a temporary escape from their crushing reality. In a brutal world defined by cold, hunger, and despair, alcohol offered a small, often desperately needed comfort. It was a form of self-medication, a temporary escape from the constant ache of cold and hunger, a fleeting moment of warmth and oblivion. The communal act of sharing a drink, even a meager one, also provided a vital social ritual, a way to maintain some semblance of camaraderie and connection in communities under immense stress. It helped to dull the edges of their brutal existence, to numb the physical pains and the psychological anxieties, if only for a few precious hours. It was the medieval equivalent of binge-watching a bad reality show, just with more actual discomfort. For the peasant, a tankard of ale might have been the closest thing they had to a spa day, a brief reprieve from the relentless demands of survival, allowing them to forget, however momentarily, the frozen fields and the empty stomachs. While fermented drinks offered benefits in terms of calories and safer hydration, the health aspects were, predictably, a mixed bag. Yes, the alcohol killed some of the nasties in the water, making it safer to drink than the alternative. But excessive consumption, particularly in an already malnourished and weakened state, brought its own set of problems. Alcoholism, liver damage, impaired judgment in a dangerous world, and the consumption of empty calories that provided energy without essential nutrients, these were all very real drawbacks. Imagine an entire population, already teetering on the brink of collapse, now adding the complexities of chronic alcohol consumption to their list of woes. Yet for many, the immediate psychological and caloric benefits outweighed the long-term health risks. In a world where life expectancy was already abysmally low and death could come from 1,000 different directions, the solace of a drink was often a risk worth taking. It was a grim calculus of immediate survival against future suffering, a choice that highlighted the profound desperation of their daily lives. Let's talk about the Grim Reaper. During the Little Ice Age, this particular entity was working overtime, putting in more shifts than a modern gig economy worker with 6 side hustles. Death, in its myriad forms, was an incredibly high, visible, and constant presence in daily life. Death from starvation, slow and agonizing, as bodies wasted away to nothing. Death from exposure, freezing solid in the open fields or within their drafty homes. Death from a myriad of diseases, respiratory infections, gastrointestinal ills, and pestilences, all exacerbated by cold and malnutrition. And, of course, the occasional bandit attack, a fall into an icy river, or a feudal lord's arbitrary justice. Infant and child mortality, as we've discussed, was astronomically high. Life expectancy plummeted. It wasn't just a threat, it was a constant, almost mundane reality. The average peasant would likely witness dozens, if not hundreds, of deaths within their lifetime, many of them close family and friends. It was a world where mourning was frequent, but often curtailed by the pressing, relentless demands of their own survival. This omnipresence of death led to a strange, almost casual acceptance of its inevitability. Not indifference, certainly, for grief was still a powerful force, but a forced pragmatism. Funerals were quick affairs, often simple burials in the village churchyard, without elaborate ceremony or prolonged mourning periods. There was little time or energy for extended grief when the living were still struggling to survive. Bodies were prepared hastily, prayers offered, and then it was back to the fields, back to the fire, back to the relentless struggle. "Don't worry," the Grim Reaper seemed to whisper. "He'll be back for your entire family next week. He's very reliable." This forced pragmatism, this normalization of death, was a psychological coping mechanism, a way to process the overwhelming scale of loss without entirely succumbing to despair. It meant acknowledging death as a natural, if unwelcome, part of the cycle of life, a constant companion rather than a shocking event. It was a grim, stoic acceptance of a fate that seemed utterly beyond their control. Even the final rites of passage were impacted by the relentless cold. Frozen ground made burial incredibly challenging, sometimes impossible. Digging a grave in earth that was as hard as rock required immense effort, often necessitating long delays or the abandonment of individual burials in favor of mass graves once the spring thaw arrived. Imagine the psychological burden of living with the unburied dead, waiting for the earth to soften enough to receive them. The disrespect to the dead, the inability to provide a proper, timely burial, added another layer of psychological distress to an already suffering population. For those who died away from home, in migrations or during foraging, their bodies might simply be left to the elements, an anonymous victim of the cold. It underscored the brutal indifference of nature and the utter fragility of human custom in the face of overwhelming environmental forces. Even in death, the Little Ice Age refused to grant its victims peace, forcing the living to endure the indignity and sorrow of an imperfect farewell. When traditional prayers seemed to bounce off the perpetually gray, frozen sky, when the established church struggled to offer satisfying explanations for the relentless misery, people began to seek more radical spiritual solutions. The Little Ice Age, with its famines and plagues, became fertile ground for the rise of fervent religious sects and often extreme apocalyptic movements. The flagellants, for instance, became a prominent, if horrifying, sight. Bands of penitents, clad in robes, would parade through towns and villages, publicly whipping themselves with scourges, believing that by mortifying their flesh, they could atone for their sins and appease an angry God, thereby ending the suffering. When God seems to have utterly abandoned you, it's time to try a new religion, or just whip yourself until you feel better. Or worse, extremist preachers emerged, proclaiming the end of the world, interpreting every frost and famine as a sign of the imminent second coming or the final judgment. It was a desperate, visceral response to incomprehensible suffering, a search for meaning in the madness, even if that meaning was terrifying. At its core, the rise of these extreme religious movements was a desperate human attempt to find meaning in inexplicable suffering. Why was God punishing them? What spiritual failing had led to such widespread, relentless misery? Theological frameworks, often pushed to their limits, were bent and contorted to explain the unexplainable. Some movements focused on intense personal piety and asceticism, believing that by purifying themselves, they could collectively atone for humanity's sins. Others embraced fatalistic interpretations, believing that the suffering was simply a prelude to a better spiritual afterlife, a testing ground for the faithful. The very intensity of their devotion, however grim, offered a powerful psychological anchor, a sense of purpose and explanation in a world that otherwise seemed utterly arbitrary and cruel. It was easier to believe in an angry but ultimately just God, even one who inflicted immense pain, than in a universe that simply didn't care. The search for meaning became paramount, even if that meaning was found in the most extreme and self-destructive forms of faith. These fervent, often unconventional movements sometimes posed a significant challenge to the established church. The institutional clergy, often seen as corrupt or ineffective, struggled to provide satisfying answers to a population grappling with existential dread. Their traditional sermons on repentance and divine justice often felt inadequate in the face of such prolonged, widespread suffering. This intellectual and spiritual vacuum allowed new interpretations to flourish, sometimes labeled as heresies by the Orthodox Church. These challengers often emphasized direct personal experience with God, questioned the authority of the hierarchy, or offered more radical interpretations of Scripture. While many of these movements were brutally suppressed by the Inquisition and secular authorities, their emergence highlighted the profound spiritual turmoil and the desperate need for answers that the Little Ice Age ignited. It was a period of intense religious ferment, where the frozen fields and starving masses became a crucible for new beliefs, new doubts, and a fundamental reevaluation of humanity's relationship with the divine. Before the Little Ice Age began its slow, chilling embrace, medieval Europe, though certainly not a technological powerhouse by modern standards, had experienced periods of slow but steady agricultural innovation. New plow designs, rudimentary crop rotation methods, and improvements in water and wind power were gradually improving productivity. But as the cold set in, this sluggish progress ground to a halt. The shift was stark, from innovation to pure, unadulterated survival. Who needs a new plow design when your fields are effectively glaciers or waterlogged bogs? Who has the time or resources to experiment with new crop strains when your current ones are failing spectacularly? The immediate, overwhelming priority was simply to make it through the next winter, to find enough food to feed your family, to avoid freezing to death. Just survive the winter, peasant. That's your innovation. All creative energy, all surplus labor, all intellectual effort was diverted to the most basic, fundamental tasks of staying alive. The pursuit of knowledge, of improvement, became a luxury that a starving, freezing population simply could not afford. The reasons for this technological stagnation were manifold, stemming directly from the environmental crisis. There was no surplus wealth to invest in new tools or infrastructure. Every spare coin, every extra ounce of labor, every shred of resource was needed for immediate consumption or basic maintenance. Peasants, living on the absolute brink, had neither the time nor the energy for experimentation. Trying out a new, unproven seed strain or an untested farming technique could mean the difference between a meager harvest and total starvation. The incentive structure was entirely skewed towards caution and tradition, not innovation. Why risk a precious, tiny surplus on something new that might fail when sticking to the old ways, however ineffective, offered a tiny glimmer of predictability? Lords, too, faced with diminishing returns from their estates, had less wealth to invest in grand agricultural projects or new technologies. The entire economic and social system became paralyzed by scarcity, unable to generate the capital or the conditions necessary for technological advancement. Progress didn't just slow, it effectively froze over, much like the rivers and fields. In a grim historical irony, the Little Ice Age effectively reintroduced some of the conditions that characterized what historians once broadly, and somewhat inaccurately, called the Dark Ages, periods of reduced cultural and technological advancement. Prolonged hardship, chronic resource scarcity, widespread famine, and incessant warfare, often exacerbated by resource competition, can stifle creativity and societal advancement. When a society is fighting for its very existence, when its intellectual and economic resources are entirely consumed by basic survival, the conditions for scientific inquiry, artistic flourishing, or technological breakthroughs simply don't exist. The focus narrows, the future shrinks, and the capacity for abstract thought or long-term planning dwindles. The Little Ice Age was a stark demonstration of how deeply intertwined climate, environment, and human progress truly are. A few degrees of global temperature drop, sustained for centuries, can plunge an entire continent into a state of perpetual struggle, where the ingenuity once used for innovation is now exclusively deployed for the grim, desperate task of simply staying alive. All right. After all that talk of freezing, starving, and general misery, here's the kicker. Despite all odds, despite nature's best efforts to wipe them off the map, humanity, in the form of our perpetually unwashed, often freezing, and chronically hungry medieval peasants, stubbornly, ridiculously insisted on surviving. Not only that, they somehow managed to pass on their genes, their misery, and a few peculiar habits to the next generation. That, my friends, is dedication. That's the sheer, bloody-minded tenacity of the human spirit. They didn't just roll over and die. They adapted, they endured, they grumbled, and they kept going. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't pretty, but it was, undeniably, survival. They became living proof that even when everything is stacked against you, even when the world seems determined to eradicate your very existence, a certain stubborn will to endure can prevail. And for that, we can offer a genuinely, if still slightly sarcastic, grudging admiration. The centuries of cold and scarcity forced profound, long-term changes in agricultural practices that ultimately stuck, even after the climate began to warm. Peasants learned the hard way which crops were more resilient to cold, damp conditions. New, hardier crop strains, particularly of rye and oats, gained prominence over less robust wheat. Different planting schedules were adopted, hedging against late frosts and early snows. There was a greater focus on livestock suitable for cold climates and on developing better methods for storing fodder. Innovations in drainage, crucial for waterlogged fields, became more widespread. Even small-scale climate modification, like constructing stone walls that could retain some residual heat and shelter fields from wind, became part of the landscape. These weren't grand scientific breakthroughs, but rather generations of trial and error, of desperate adaptation, slowly accumulating into a body of practical, resilient knowledge. The Little Ice Age, brutal as it was, became a harsh tutor, forcing medieval farmers to become more adaptable and resourceful than ever before. Beyond specific agricultural techniques, the Little Ice Age fundamentally hardened European society itself. It forged a population accustomed to hardship, capable of enduring immense suffering, and deeply wary of the unpredictable whims of nature. This wasn't a sudden transformation, but a generational conditioning, etching a deep-seated caution and resilience into the collective psyche. Turns out, being miserable for centuries makes you really good at being miserable. It also makes you incredibly tough, adaptable, and resourceful. This hardened resilience would serve them, and their descendants, well in future centuries, preparing them for other challenges, other famines, other wars. The experience shaped their architecture, their clothing, their food preservation techniques, and even their social structures, creating a society deeply rooted in pragmatism and a cautious optimism born of endless struggle. It was a crucible that purified their resolve, forging a people who understood, in their very bones, the true meaning of survival against overwhelming odds. As we wrap up our tour of medieval frostbite and despair, it's crucial to take a moment and acknowledge the true, unsung heroes of this story, the nameless, unwashed, chronically freezing peasants. They don't have statues erected in their honor. Their names aren't inscribed in history books, unless they were particularly problematic heretics or exceptionally unfortunate victims of some noble's wrath. There are no romantic ballads sung about their relentless battles with frozen turnips or their heroic struggles against perpetual dampness. Yet it was their sheer, unyielding grit, their stubborn insistence on putting one foot in front of the other, day after agonizing day, that formed the bedrock of subsequent history. Their daily, unrecorded struggle, their unglamorous perseverance, allowed civilization to continue. So, next time you complain about your smart thermostat or your latte being too cold, remember them. And then complain anyway, because you've earned it, but at least acknowledge the lineage of suffering that made your complaints possible. Their legacy is invisible, yet utterly pervasive. It's in the genetic code you carry, in the language you speak, in the very foundations of the towns and cities that grew from their toil. It's in the folk wisdom that still lingers, in the deep-seated cultural memory of scarcity, in the pragmatic resilience that defines many European cultures. The quiet, persistent effort of countless generations of unnamed peasants allowed their societies to weather one of the most prolonged and profound climatic shocks in recent history. They laid the foundation upon which future societies were built, societies that would eventually develop the science, technology, and economic systems that allowed humanity to escape such brutal environmental vulnerabilities. Their lives were not celebrated, their contributions rarely acknowledged, but without their enduring tenacity, without their sheer stubbornness to survive, the trajectory of human history would have been profoundly different, and you, dear listener, quite simply wouldn't be here. Think of them as the silent, suffering scaffolding upon which the grand edifice of modern society was slowly, painfully constructed. Each generation, shivering through another harsh winter, tilling another reluctant field, passing on another desperate, ingenious trick for survival, added another brick to that foundation. It was their resilience that ensured there were enough people left to eventually populate the burgeoning towns, to fuel the Renaissance, to spark the age of exploration, to endure the Reformation, and to eventually drive the scientific and industrial revolutions. Without the anonymous peasant enduring the Little Ice Age, the narrative of Western civilization, as we know it, would be entirely different, and frankly, a lot shorter. They were the ground zero of modernity, the primal source of the human stream, pushing forward through unimaginable adversity, ensuring that somewhere, centuries later, their descendants could complain about buffered streaming services and lukewarm takeout. Their invisible legacy is, in fact, everything. All right. So after centuries of what amounted to a planetary freezer burn, the Little Ice Age eventually, mercifully, began its slow retreat. But don't imagine a sudden, dramatic warmth, like flipping a switch. It was more like someone slowly, almost imperceptibly, turning up the thermostat by a tiny fraction of a degree each decade. A shift so gradual, it would take generations to fully notice. Roughly from the mid-19th century onwards, the world slowly, tentatively, began to warm again. Finally, a bit of warmth. Just in time for, never mind, different problems now, like industrial pollution and global warming. Always different problems. The rivers began to freeze less frequently, growing seasons lengthened, and the pervasive cold slowly, reluctantly loosened its grip. It wasn't a triumphant victory, more like a collective sigh of relief that echoed across continents, often unnoticed by those living through the change. The world slowly warmed, the glaciers retreated for a time, and the Thames stopped hosting pubs on its frozen surface. But the memory, the experience, the deep-seated caution of centuries of cold and scarcity lingered. It shaped future generations, leaving a cultural imprint that was profound and pervasive. The folk wisdom about the weather, the traditions of extreme frugality, the agricultural practices designed for resilience, these didn't vanish overnight. They became embedded in the cultural fabric, passed down through proverbs, superstitions, and ingrained habits. Even as the climate grew milder, the collective memory of the famine years, of the relentless cold, of the omnipresent threat of starvation, remained, a ghost in the cultural machine. It fostered a certain stoicism, a skepticism towards prosperity, and a deep-seated understanding that good times were often fleeting and hardship could return at any moment. A society forever changed by centuries of struggle against the cold doesn't simply revert to its previous state. New architectural styles, developed to better insulate homes, remained. Food preservation techniques, honed by generations of scarcity, continued to be vital skills. Social structures, once fractured by famine and displacement, often rebuilt themselves with a stronger emphasis on communal support and collective resilience, lessons learned from the brutal trials of the past. But alongside these adaptations came persistent anxieties. The fear of a bad harvest, of a harsh winter, of a sudden return to scarcity, remained a subconscious undercurrent, even in times of relative prosperity. The Little Ice Age left an indelible mark, shaping not just the land and its people, but their very mindset, imbuing them with a deep-seated caution and a profound understanding of humanity's fragile relationship with the natural world. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons are learned not from triumph, but from prolonged, miserable endurance. And so we've come full circle. From the initial absurdity of their existence, armed with nothing but bad teeth and a healthy fear of demons, to the relentless, soul-crushing grip of the Little Ice Age. Our unwashed, often freezing, and chronically hungry medieval peasants stubbornly refused to die off, despite nature's best efforts. They didn't have climate models, they didn't have central heating, they didn't have Amazon Prime. What they had was an unparalleled capacity for suffering, an ingenious and often revolting knack for making do, and a truly impressive, almost spiteful will to survive. They ate bark, they shared beds with pigs, they burned their furniture, they blamed witches, and they somehow, against all rational expectations, persisted. The absurdity of it all, the sheer brutality, is almost comical in its scale, if it weren't for the very real, agonizing suffering that underpinned every frozen turnip and every shivering breath. This entire saga is a testament to humanity's enduring, stubborn will to survive. You can freeze them, starve them, plague them, put them through a multi-century climatic apocalypse, and they'll still find a way to annoy their descendants with their existence. It's a fundamental, almost irrational drive, deeply embedded in our DNA, to simply keep going, to find a way, however desperate, however disgusting, however seemingly futile. The medieval peasant wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, but their collective struggle, their quiet, daily defiance against an indifferent world, is a profound statement about the resilience of the human spirit. They endured, they adapted, they innovated in the grimiest of ways, and they ensured that the torch of humanity, however dimly flickering, was passed to the next generation. It's a story not of triumph, but of tenacious, miserable endurance, a quiet victory against overwhelming odds. Perhaps, just perhaps, we can learn something from their misery. Like, maybe don't make your entire civilization reliant on a perfectly stable climate. Just a thought. Or perhaps, don't build your entire societal structure on a foundation that benefits a few at the top while leaving the masses utterly vulnerable to environmental shocks. It's almost as if history has a habit of rhyming, isn't it? As we grapple with our own climate challenges, with our own impending doom, albeit with significantly better heating and far more options for artisanal gruel, it's a stark reminder that even a few degrees of change, sustained over time, can have catastrophic, existential consequences for societies. They didn't have the science, they didn't have the data, but they experienced the brutal reality. We, on the other hand, have all the data, all the science, and a very comfortable couch to complain from. Progress. And that, dear viewer, is how those incredibly resilient, perpetually uncomfortable medieval peasants stubbornly survived the brutal Ice Age. They didn't just adapt. They quite literally froze their way into the future, ensuring you could sit here, presumably warm and well-fed, contemplating their misery. So, next time you feel a chill, spare a thought for your distant, unwashed ancestors, and then, perhaps, just perhaps, appreciate your central heating a little bit more. If you've managed to stay awake through this comprehensive, utterly gripping, and possibly sleep-inducing deep dive into historical suffering, consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care. Now go to sleep, you pampered modern softy. And try not to dream of frozen turnips. You're welcome.